is for the Joint Revenue Committee meeting on Tuesday, June 9th. Senator Case, Senator Dockstader, Senator Ide, Senator Pappas, Representative Brown,
Here.
Representative Campbell, Representative Lean,
Here.
Representative Lucas,
Present.
Representative Riggins, Representative Storer, Representative Stivar, Representative Wharf, Co-Chairman Locke, Chairman McEwen. All are present, Mr. Chairman.
Go through Amendment A, just some quick highlights. I think there were some questions from people on the committee yesterday when we finished up.
So, okay, Mr. Chairman, so Amendment A was the constitutional amendment that split residential property out from the all other property class. And so we had a bill last year and it was asked to be redrafted for our next meeting, which would implement that by putting residential property into its own class in statute. It would set the rate at 8.3%, which is currently the all other property class, and statute is currently 9.5%. So it would separate residential property out from that class and set that rate at 8.3%. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. So
I believe we amended that in yesterday, didn't we?
So, Mr. Chairman, so to avoid confusion, so the Amendment A did not determine the rate. It just said that the legislature or that residential property is a separate class, and then it's up to the legislature to specify the rate for that property. So the bill that we had last year, and that was asked to be redrafted yesterday, was Senate File 78. And it would establish that as a separate class and establish the rate at 8 3/10%. But also define what residential property means. So that's essentially where we left things off yesterday, Mr. Chairman.
So we're at 8, 9.5, 9.5, and 11.
So today,
What the legislation proposes.
oh, sorry. So the legislation, proposes to create this new class of residential property at 8.3%, then leave the remainder of the all other property class at 9.5%, where it currently is today.
And one other quick question for everyone. What's the gap? The defined gap, like 8.3. Does the other go to 12.3 or is it 3 point something?
So under the Constitution, both the all other property class and the residential property class are tied to industrial property, and they cannot be more than 4 percentage points or 40% lower than the industrial property class. Or I think it's the other way. Industrial property cannot be more than 4% or 40% higher than those two classes separately. So that's why, so that at 11.5%, we could not go lower than 8.3%.
And one last question. Can you walk us through the difference between commercial and industrial? How that line is drawn?
Might see if someone from the Department of Revenue might handle that better than me. There is a definition, and I don't have that at my fingertips right now, but Ken might have that more
think-
off the top of his head.
Mr. Gill's on his way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ken Gill with the Department of Revenue, Property Tax Division. Your question on the difference between commercial and industrial. In 3911-101, little a, Romanet 14, property used for industrial purposes means those properties valued under Wyoming Statute 3913-102M 2 through X, excluding 3913-102M 6 through 9, and those properties used or held for manufacturing, milling, converting, producing, processing or fabricating materials, the extraction or processing of minerals, the mechanical, chemical, or electronic transformation of property into new products. So that is industrial. The way I like to explain industrial, Mr. Chairman, would be raw product in, finished product out.
We'll discuss the meat grinder today, I promise. So would a company like L&H be industrial or commercial?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not familiar with that company. I'm sorry.
They do mine support.
If they're supporting an industrial operation, they would be industrial.
Okay. It's just an example. I'm not trying to pick on L&H.
Sure.
Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Gale, Mr. Anderson. There's been a little conversation, maybe somebody answered it. I don't know as I heard a final determination. I think I overheard a conversation with Ms. Huxtable too. What on wind turbines, they're typically on ag zoned property. Maybe, I don't know for sure. I think that that's the case. And is that the appropriate designation for those? It sounded like they could maybe fit under industrial from your description right there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Seems to be on. Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, it looks like we got a microphone working now. So wind turbines, where are they located? They could be located anywhere. I'm not privy to where they are located. Yes, they could be located on agricultural land, but the county I come from, there's some wind turbines on the city dump. So they could be anywhere. And I guess the question that maybe you were asking, is it appropriate for that land to be agricultural? Not to put words in your mouth. Is that so? I can't really answer that. Are you talking about the entire lease? Because many times these companies lease the entire property, or just where the turbine sits. I really can't answer that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Gill. Yeah, that's, I think there's just confusion out there that you hear that asked sometimes of that. And yeah, it could be a grazing lease on there as well too. So it's still agriculture. So it's just a little confusing. I was just asking to see if you had a different answer than what's sort of circling around. Thank you.
So they're conveniently located at the dump when it's time to take them down?
Mr. Chairman, I can't answer that. I apologize.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gill, would it be appropriate, do you think, to look at the infrastructure of the turbines and the footprint of the turbines and take a portion of that land and put it into industrial?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I think that would be a policy decision of this body.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quick question for you. I thought that when it's state assessed, wind farms, it was my understanding that you guys had a pretty standard policy approach you did to that, or you used for that, assessment of land. I was just curious if that's true or if that varies, for the state assessed as well. I just wanted to understand that just a bit. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that is correct. So they would be at the 11.5 assessment level for state assessed properties, state assessed energy producers. They are at 11.5% in the land, because in statute, the department is required to look at that land, even if the company doesn't own the land. We look at that lease and we say, we treat it as they do own the land. So everything is at 11.5%. Now is it at the same market value that maybe that county's industrial land is at? Maybe, maybe not. It could vary.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could we go back to the Amendment A discussion, if possible?
Quickly, but yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Josh, so what we voted on yesterday was to take all of residential down to 8.3%?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's my recollection.
And Mr. Chairman, could we entertain an amendment to that at this point in time?
I don't see why not. I'll follow the agenda that closely anyway.
Well, Mr. Chairman, there was some confusion, I think, among the members yesterday. So I would like to propose an amendment that actually only takes owner-occupied primary households, similar to what we've done elsewhere, down to the 8.3% and leave the rest of residential at 9.5%. I mean, partly this is huge amount of residential comes from second homes in Teton County. And again, the whole reason we're trying to provide property tax relief is to help people stay in their homes. There's certainly a lot of folks that can afford 9.5%. Our property tax rates are still one of the lowest in the country. And even though our valuations are high, it's actually quite meaningful revenue to the state. So I would propose that we only drop owner-occupied primary homes with 8 months.
Mr. Chairman, do you need a second?
Yes.
Second.
Representative Stivar.
No.
Mike, here we go. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. So the question was on the subclass that's authorized under Amendment A. I don't have that language right in front of me, but both the subclasses would be tied to, or the main class and the subclass would be both tied, I think, to the industrial property rate. So neither of them that could go lower than that 8.3%. But there's nothing, no language tying those two classes together necessarily, Mr. Chairman.
Could we approach this from a different angle? Put a floor in it or a ceiling? However you want to word that, and still be constitutional?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure I'm quite following the idea there.
Rather than put the owner occupied language in there, could we set it at 3 million, like on the 25%?
So the Constitution requires the legislature to establish a assessment rate for the residential property class. Where that is said is a policy choice. I think if we did it, if we established a class based on the value instead of whether it's owner occupied or not, I don't know that that would be within the language of that amendment. It allowed just for one subclass, which was for owner occupied primary residences. So establishing a different subclass could potentially not follow that one authorized subclass that's in the constitutional language.
Didn't Amendment A just define it as residential property?
So, yes, Mr. Chairman, so it is, residential property is a separate class, and except for a subclass of primary residences, other subclasses would not likely be authorized under the Constitution. So if we try to establish a subclass of houses under 3 million and over 3 million, that could potentially violate that prohibition against creating subclasses of property.
Thank you. Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarification, that subclass is not required. It's optional and available to the legislature to impose or not impose. Is that accurate?
Correct. Mr. Chairman, the subclass says the legislature may establish a subclass of primary residences.
Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In response to Representative Stivar's observation about rental properties, I certainly understand the thought there, but the evidence is such that research shows that that doesn't really happen very often necessarily, that when the property tax goes down for a landlord, it doesn't necessarily translate into lower rentals for the most part.
Representative Wharf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That is one of the calls that I took from a constituent, and it involved a gentleman that owned property that he was leasing. And he said he's had really good tenants. They've been there forever. And he said he couldn't afford to pay the increase. So his only option was to increase the amount that he was renting his properties to the people that are there. So it is real. And I know it's hard because we're looking at what's going on in one particular county that's kind of impacting everybody else. But we also want to make sure that the people that are renting are not priced out of the ability to rent neither, because both those are not very good scenarios. So I think there's more of an issue to that than perhaps just what goes on in one county.
Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A fair observation. I will say, though, that the Teton County represents about a third of residential property tax for the state. So the revenues that come out of Teton County are quite significant and meaningful. And in fact, our valuations are so high such that, most of that money is going back to the state for schools across the state. So it's not really a lone wolf out there. I think it's an important source of income for the state and for our school kids.
Representative Worf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want this to be a back and forth, but I guess the question I ask, and I ask this because I don't live in Teton County, but as difficult as it is for younger kids to buy a home today, how difficult is it for people growing up in Teton County? I mean, I know a few people that are kind of the old school Teton County people, and I'm hearing that they're basically being bought out because they can't stay there. And I don't want to dispute what's going on in Teton County, but I do know I have friends there that are very concerned with the price, how everything just keeps going up and there's no break, there's no relief for the people that maybe aren't as well established, I'll say, as others. And so I think we can't just look at the top, we got to look at the bottom and make sure we got room for everybody.
Well, we could do a constitutional amendment and treat Teton County different than all the other counties. It's a joke. Okay, does everybody kind of understand what it all is about now? So we'll go ahead and vote on the amendment. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
No. Pretty sure the noes have it. Okay, thanks. Okay. Next on the docket is commercial property tax.
Chairman, members of the committee, Matt Saka with the LSO. The first topic of the day for today is commercial property assessed values. This was added recently. So I put this table together from Department of Revenue data. There should be you got a hard copy this morning sitting in, on your chair at your desk or at the table. The first part of that is basically the assessed value of all commercial properties from 2019 forward to 2025 with a percent change. That just gives you some information about the change over time. But I think you guys did talk a little bit about this yesterday with the Department of Revenue, and the Department of Revenue noted that there's nuances to these commercial properties because a lot of changes in, commercial companies and whatnot. So these percentage changes aren't apples to apples. And I think DOR talked about maybe looking at trying to get some data on increases by company kind of thing, whatnot. So, and DOR can speak to that and maybe if you have questions. So that does have the percentage change, but I think there's some nuances to that information. And then on the back side of the page is an excerpt from 2024 Revenue Committee. Dean Tempty had put together some information regarding different the property tax rates and stuff from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. So I had remembered that he had done this. So I just threw that in as a second page for your information. That data is from 2022. I did look and there is updated information that I could put together if you guys are interested. But that just kind of outlines Wyoming's commercial property tax rates compared to, kind of the surrounding states and as well as North Dakota. So other than that, I don't really have much to add. Department of Revenue really has more information about commercial property if you have questions.
The reason I brought it up is I've talked to a couple of my constituents and me also. My commercial property tax rate went way up as soon as the other tax rates went down. Maybe it's just coincidental. I don't know. That's why we're discussing it though.
Yeah, I think DOR, has talked about looking into some of these to try to do some apple to apple comparisons, but if they have anything to add, you can. We'll probably bring that
Mr.
for the
Gill.
meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ken Gill, Department of Revenue. Mr. Sackett is absolutely correct on the first page of the sheet. Seeing those percentage changes from year to year, those are never apple to apple because businesses have been added, new commercial properties been built, new subdivisions have been made. Multiple things could have happened within that county. So as I told you yesterday, I'm happy to look at accounts that have existed over a series of years and provide that data for you. And I will do that, Mr. Chairman. On the second page, this is from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I might mention the Tax Foundation again for 2025 has made Wyoming the #1 state for commercial property taxes, or not property taxes, taxes in general. So we still are the #1 state with the rates and the amount that commercial properties are paying.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just a quick question. You'd mentioned yesterday that 70% of the businesses are showing zero because of the 75. Remind me again, did we pass that in? Did that go in effect last year? So let me ask you, would we have seen the impact of that commercial personal property bill in 25, or would 26 be the first time we see that? If you could help me with that.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, 2026 was the first year that was effective for the 2026 tax year. So the information that Mr. Sackett provided includes commercial real property and personal property, but it's only through 25. We have not compiled that yet for 2026. And you're correct, 70% of the reported businesses statewide that are reporting personal property, business personal property, will receive a tax bill of zero. Probably won't even receive a bill.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Gill. I really do appreciate Mr. Hackett and Sackett and Mr. Gill's information on this. This is really helpful to me. I appreciate that. But as you mentioned, one of the things if you could help us with that, where it's apples and apples and where it's oranges, we do want to see that breakout because we'd like to see where is it expanding, where is it not expanding. I know you still have to pull the data together. I know this was a last minute drop. We always laugh about these June meetings. It's less than perfect timing. But if you could give us as much analysis of that, just so when we look at these numbers, we do look at them, because it's a little bit, even that spreadsheet, I always work with you. Even in that case, you're kind of just looking at that big number and you see a jump year by year, but it's hard to understand how much of that is based on current business, how much of that is new business, and we want to understand that. So sorry, I just wanted to make sure we ask for that data, as much of it as we can get, so we can take an honest look at this. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to do that, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Representative Lean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for joining us and thank you for the sheet. I have a question about Goshen County on here. In 2025, their change is negative 31%, restoring them to 2019 values. Do you have any idea what happened in the commercial property world that would take them all the way back to 2019 values?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lean, I can't answer that. I can certainly research that and reach out to that local county assessor and find out what happened. Maybe something was demolished. Maybe a large commercial property was demolished. I don't know that answer. I apologize.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My next question would be about Laramie County. Can you walk me through how data centers are taxed? Are they industrial or are they commercial?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lean, they are commercial. I don't believe that data centers fit the definition that we read earlier of industrial property. Of course, that is a policy decision of this body. When you look at the definition of industrial property, it's a raw product in, and I'm paraphrasing, a raw product in, a finished product out. I don't believe that's happening. Like a brewery, let's say, for instance, a brewery is bringing in raw product, making brew, and then bottling it and selling it, making it an industrial property. Of course, that would be a policy decision of the body. If you look at 3911-101, the statute that I cited earlier, when you go to the industrial definition, there's capital A, capital B, capital C. You could add a capital D and maybe define and use a definition that's already in statute for data centers. And that definitely would be a policy decision on your end.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing I would say, in the definition you read, it did talk about digital processing. And one might argue, and I personally would argue, that most of these data centers, they don't just hold data. They process data and they provide a product back. I just wanted to throw that out because that is common. And nothing just holds data. I shouldn't say that. There are backup systems that are designed for nothing but storing data. But at the end of the day, even they provide, for lack of a better term, they process and provide data back. And digital was in the wording of industrial. So it's something to at least discuss at some point and make sure we are clear on that. That's at least what I heard when you read it.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, being a former assessor, clarity in the law is always better than something that's not clear and gray, because we've gone through a lot of litigation over the years on different things in property tax, and so clarity in the law would definitely be the way to go.
Follow up?
Sorry, just a quick follow-up, and that was not meant in any way as a criticism. Please, I apologize not realizing how I said that. I didn't mean it to come across that way, but I get it. It's complicated. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, no offense taken at all.
Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are commercial properties valued typically on market value or replacement cost less depreciation, or production income approach to value? Is that, I assume it's different, but what's typical in value in commercial property? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, there are three approaches to value, as we've discussed at length. There's the cost approach to value, which would be replacement cost new, then less depreciation. We have the market approach, which would be sales comparison. So you take a subject property, you have some comparables that have sold, and you come up with a value for that subject property after making adjustments to those comparables. Then you have the income approach, and that basically it's the worth of the property or the value of the property based on its earning potential. So the three approaches, and all three are considered in all appraisal.
Follow up.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Thank you for that. So you're saying all three approaches are used on each property, or maybe that, I think that's what I'm hearing. I've got some commercial property and, they can't find comps of, multi-tenant commercial office buildings that have sold in the last 30 years. And so you jump around replacement cost, new, less depreciation, isn't anywhere close to a cap rate on an income approach, so to speak. So do you blend all of those together essentially, or can you use one independently? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, they're all three independent appraisals. They do reconcile together. They're considered. It doesn't mean they're developed on every property. Again, we're talking mass appraisal here. We're not talking a subject property. We're talking a universe of properties and valuing them statistically similar to one another.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to discussion on electricity production tax. Oh, yeah. Do we have any public comment? Now we'll move on to electricity production tax.
So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Quilty from our office was going to start us off on that, and he stepped away here briefly. So, but he's going to start off with a discussion of the 2024 working group, which was put together as members of the Revenue Committee, the Corporations Committee, Minerals Committee. But he should be right back. He might be out discussing with Senator Case, actually, but I'm not sure. So bear with us for 1 second, Mr. Chairman.
Not a problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dalton Quilty with LSO Budget Fiscal. As always, it's a pleasure to present before the committee. Today, I will be going over the summary of the 2024 state taxation of electricity generation issue brief, as well as a more in-depth review of some recent legislation on electricity taxation. So the memorandum itself is quite thick, so it's going to be in your electronic files. We weren't able to make paper copies. The memorandum summarizes the LSO's 2024 issue brief, the state taxation of electricity generation. The brief compares Western United States tax policies in Section 1, pricing in Section 2, evaluates Wyoming's energy revenue streams in Section 3, analyzes regional wind factors in Section 4, and details previous legislative actions and potential revenues from electricity taxation in Section 5. As it is used throughout the memorandum, the Western United States includes Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming. And as it's used throughout the memorandum, Western states plus includes those 11 aforementioned Western United States and North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. Now, the national markets for electrical generation, distribution, and consumption are uniquely complex due to a variety of reasons, such as diverse state tax structures, distinct wholesale and retail markets, regional disparities, diverse business models, and varying regulatory frameworks. The brief prioritizes factual data over econometric forecasts. It incorporates estimates where necessary, however, but we do note that their selection of assumptions remains inherently subjective. The analysis conducted excludes federal income taxes and credits, the federal portion of federal mineral royalties, abandoned mine reclamation fees, and black lung fees. They're excluded for two reasons. The first is Wyoming policymakers cannot control federal policy, And the second is the link between federal appropriations and federal fees like abandoned mine reclamation and black lung fees to services funded by state appropriations is tenuous. The sole exception in the brief is in the 2010 wind costing model. The model retains federal components for continuity as LSO was charged with updating and not modifying that model. The inclusion of those federal taxes on wind results in a maximum difference of about 59 cents or less than 1% of the average computed cost of generating 1 megawatt hour of electricity from wind in the Western States Plus. Now, looking specifically at Western state tax policies, LSO staff analyzed tax structures across the Western States Plus electric generators, including corporate income, sales and use, ad valorem, gross receipts, franchise, and other excise taxes like those imposed on electricity generation or production. A summary of all identified taxes and credits can be found in Appendix 1, Attachment A. The brief concludes that while Wyoming's overall tax rates are generally lower than regional peers, its unique wind generation tax and lack of incentives creates a comparatively less favorable environment both for construction of electrical generation facilities, especially wind generation, and residential consumption of electricity when compared to other Western States Plus. Of the Western States Plus, Wyoming has the lowest combined total state and local sales and use taxes of states imposing one, though it exceeds the median of all the Western States Plus once other states' exemptions are included into the total. In the Western States Plus, Wyoming is one of 9 states without a gross receipts tax on electrical generation, one of 4 without a corporate income tax on electrical generators, and maintains the second lowest effective property tax rate on utilities, the third lowest if you include exemptions. Now, looking at electricity generation, consumption, and pricing, Table 1 in the memorandum details Wyoming and national power plants under construction, permitted, or pending construction as of 2024. As seen in the table, most of Wyoming's planned generation was wind-based. 88% of the planned generation is wind-based in Wyoming, whereas 85% of national planned generation was wind or solar, with 2/3 of that total being solar. Appendix 1, Attachment B, also LSO Fact Sheet 24 FSO 29, provides national statistics on generation, consumption, and prices from 2010 to 2022 for residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation consumers. This also includes breakdowns across all those industries. During this period, total U.S. electricity generation grew 2.6% as measured in megawatt hours, supporting increased consumption across all sectors except for transportation, which declined by 14.4%. Residential electricity prices saw the sharpest rise over that 2010 to 2022 period at 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which was about a 30.4% increase. From 2010 to 2022, electricity generation increased in 9 Western States Plus, but decreased in 5, including Wyoming, while consumption across all measured sectors rose in all states except for California and Wyoming. Electricity prices for the Western States Plus are highest in the residential sector, though Wyoming maintains the lowest overall sector prices among Western States Plus. Wyoming is the leading electricity exporter of the Western States Plus, consuming only 35.6% of generated electricity in 2022. The state generated over 46,000 gigawatt hours, while local sales accounted for less than 17,000 gigawatt hours in 2022. In contrast, there are several Western Plus states, including Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, and South Dakota, which record annual consumptions that exceed their total in-state generation, so they're energy importers. The growth of electric generation from renewable resources is illustrated in Appendix 1, Attachment B-1. U.S. Energy Information Administration data indicates that Wyoming recorded the 6th largest growth in renewable electricity generation among Western States Plus from 2020 to 2023. State revenue from electricity generation, comparison of feedstocks. This section builds on 2016 LSO research. The analysis compares estimated Wyoming state and local revenue from coal, natural gas, and wind energy by replacing cost ratio models with primary data from the Department of Revenue and consensus revenue estimating group metrics. In the update of this analysis, LSO staff consulted the Department of Revenue, the Wyoming Public Service Commission staff, staff of other state public service commissions, several major public utility firms operating in the Western United States, and wholesale providers of electricity. The revised scope of the analysis includes state and local taxes, sales and use taxes paid during construction of electrical generation facilities, amortized over 20 years, sales and use taxes paid post-construction, and estimated ad valorem taxes on property and equipment. The methodology provides a subtotal of generation taxes before adding feedstock-specific revenues. It excludes federal taxes and incentives, transmission-related taxes, and state lease royalties. Due to data constraints, operational sales and use taxes are not disaggregated by utility type, and construction estimates are based off of a decade of Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality Industrial Siting Division records. Table 2 and Appendix 1, Attachment C, detail these findings as revenue per megawatt hour. Natural gas generates the highest total tax receipts per megawatt hour, driven by significant ad valorem and severance taxes, followed by coal and then wind. If one is to consider only sales, use, ad valorem, and production taxes, wind generates the highest total revenue per megawatt hour, followed by gas, then coal. One note, the analysis of wind, coal, and natural gas structures are as of calendar year 2024, and they were applied to calendar year 2025 tax rates and total electrical generation. Comparison across Western states of wind taxation, wind capacity, distribution, and other factors. This section analyzes the cost of wind resource development across 11 Western states by updating the 2010 E3 model. The analysis compares state tax structures, regional construction estimates, and differences in wind capacity factors, largely aligning its assumptions with a separate recent University of Wyoming study. While both models reach similar conclusions, the University of Wyoming model uses average lifetime costs, whereas the E3 model employs a present value calculation, resulting in different cost figures. In general, differences in levelized busbar costs, or the average cost per unit of electricity generated at the generation facility, wind turbines in this case, allowing for the recovery of identified costs over the estimated life of the generation facility, are driven by state-specific regional costs and wind capacity factors. When these localized factors are excluded to focus solely on tax policy, cost differences between states are minimal, and Wyoming ranks in the middle to upper range. However, when regional costs and capacity factors are included, Wyoming, Montana, New Mexico, and Colorado emerge as the lowest cost states due to their superior wind generation potential. Overall, levelized costs have declined 25 to 50% between 2010 and 2024 for all states. When accounting for all regional and capacity factors, Montana and Wyoming rank first and second respectively for the lowest cost of wind resources. Appendix 1, Attachment D1 through D5 provides the model's updated inputs and outputs. Inputs are broken down into system financing in Attachment D1 and tax assumptions in D2. Outputs are presented both without regional adjustments using a uniform 35% capacity factor in D3 and with localized factors included in Appendix D4. And finally, Table 3, also included as Attachment D5, compares the output of the 2010 E3 model, the UW model, and both versions of the updated E3 model. Now, the final section is looking at previous legislative actions regarding electricity taxation. The Wyoming Legislature has considered or implemented several measures aimed at identifying or diversifying the state's revenue stream through electricity-related taxation. These are not all of them, but a good list of them. So Chapter 49, 2010 House Bill 101. This was the electricity generated from wind taxation. It was adopted in 2010 and established a $1 per megawatt hour excise tax on wind energy production in Wyoming. The bill provides several key exemptions. It excludes wind facilities owned by federal, state, or local governments, as well as electricity generated for personal consumption, including daily excess up to 500 kilowatt hours. Additionally, all wind production is exempt from the tax during the first 3 years of its operation. While the legislature has recently weighed removing the 3-year exemption, as was the case in 2025's House Bill 252, or increasing the tax rate, as was the case in 2021's House Bill 108, the original structure remains largely intact. In 2024, the Department of Revenue reported $8.4 million in total wind tax revenue. $3.4 million of that, the total was distributed to the state, with the remaining $5 million to local governments. Appendix 2 contains 2010 House Bill 101 as enrolled and its original fiscal note, while Appendix 3 provides a 10-year history of wind tax distributions to state and local governments, as well as the revenue generated by the wind tax by county. Chapter 104, 2020's House Bill 74, small modular nuclear reactor permitting, was adopted in 2020 and established an excise tax on the sale of electricity from small modular nuclear reactors. This framework was later expanded by 2022's House Bill 131 to apply to advanced nuclear reactors. The legislation established the tax rate at $5 per megawatt hour sold. Under current law, advanced nuclear reactors, defined as those featuring technological improvements over reactors commissioned prior to 2021 and licensed by the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, are exempt from the tax. Beginning January 1st of 2035, the exemption shall only apply if at least 80% of the uranium used for generation in the nuclear facility is sourced from within the United States. Additional exemptions apply to electricity produced for a producer's personal consumption, test or demonstration reactors, and facilities owned by state, federal, or local governments. As Wyoming currently has no active nuclear generation, annual tax collections remain at zero, though any future revenues would be distributed to the general fund. The adopted legislation, fiscal note, and underlying assumptions are provided in Appendix 4 for 2022's House Bill 74 and Appendix 5 for 2022's House Bill 131. Now, 2025 House Bill 300 was the electrical generation tax. It died in committee, but it proposed a 3.5% excise tax on annual gross earnings for electricity producers rather than a tax on production volume. To avoid double taxation, the bill allowed generators to credit all other Wyoming taxes, including excise, sales and use, ad valorem, and severance taxes on minerals consumed against the new liability. The proposal estimated a $127 million annual liability, largely offset by $108 million in tax credits, resulting in a $19 million net increase to be distributed to state and local governments. There are several technical considerations with a policy proposal, including the administrative complexity of calculating offsetting credits and the potential for unequal treatment of generators depending on their specific feedstocks or business models. The legislation, including the fiscal note and underlying assumptions, are provided in Appendix 6. 2026's House Bill 46, electricity from solar and nuclear resources taxation, failed introduction, but proposed expanding the existing wind energy generation tax established by 2010's House Bill 101 we discussed a little earlier to include solar and nuclear generation as well. The bill maintained the established excise tax rate of $1 per megawatt hour and maintained the same exceptions, allowing their application to both solar and nuclear facilities. Furthermore, the bill proposed the repeal of the existing $5 per megawatt hour excise tax, replacing it on nuclear, replacing it with the $1 per megawatt hour rate. The adjustment was intended to create a uniform tax framework across wind, solar, and nuclear sectors. Although Wyoming currently maintains separate tax structures for wind and nuclear power, the legislation would have established the state's first specific excise tax on solar generation, solar electricity. Currently, no production tax exists for solar energy in Wyoming. The full text of the proposed bill and its accompanying fiscal note are provided in Appendix 7. And the final bill we'll be discussing today is 2026 Senate File 76, Distribution of Taxes on Large Electrical Loads. This bill was not introduced in 2026. However, the bill proposed a new account to distribute sales tax revenue from very large electrical loads to cities, towns, and counties. Very large electrical loads was defined in the legislation as an electrical load of not less than 100 megawatts for a single purchaser or customer. These revenues would be pooled and then distributed to individual cities and towns and counties. By pooling these revenues, the legislation aimed to benefit all communities regardless of if there was one of these large electric facilities within. And that is included in Appendix 8, and that I will stand for any questions.
How much, how do I want to word this? Of the electricity generation, the load that we use, what's the percentage that comes off solar?
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, the percentage of the total generated electricity in Wyoming that is coming from solar? Let me check my figures and I'll get you I'll email the committee a percentage.
It is fairly small, isn't it?
It is rather small, and I want to say it should be included in one of these appendices. It doesn't break out the percentage, but it does give you the total, so I just need to crunch the numbers and I can get that back to the committee.
Thank you. Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you. And if you could give us maybe a simplified view of just the distribution across all the different types, the percentages generated would be great. Can I ask one other question?
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And one other question I have for you, you said that I think you said that the least expensive electricity generated was wind. And if I'm misstating that, please correct me. But if that is the case, has there been an analysis that said when subsidies go away, what does that do to that number? So again, if I'm incorrect on that, great, but I would like to understand too, if that statement's accurate, I almost asked how it would compare, but I think the best way to look at it is if they go away, how does it impact that number? Thank you.
So I do not think I said that wind was the cheapest. So there's kind of two sections at play here. So there was the wind cost model, and that was looking at the western states and comparing kind of how cheap it is to produce wind in those specific states. And there, Montana and Wyoming are kind of 1 and 2 for the most effective. And it's largely because we have really great wind to generate a lot of the energy. So we actually, that is one of our biggest advantages, is just the amount of wind that the state has. The other kind of section was looking at our findings in revenue per megawatt hour, kind of how much each individual feedstock is worth via taxation. And there, if you only include sales use, ad valorem, and production taxes, wind does generate the highest total revenue per megawatt hour. But that's not looking at the kind of the full scope. If you look at the full scope of things, it'd be natural gas.
Another quick question. Do the subsidies play into that?
I do not believe that we were considering the subsidies. Obviously, if you took away subsidies, it would be a bit more expensive to produce wind energy, to kind of get back at Chairman Locke's question.
Representative Worf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does the state currently collect any type of a bond requirement for these new sources of energy? I'll just leave it at that. Is there any type of bond for these products to be dismantled and removed from the state if in fact they fold?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Worf, off the top of my head, I do not know. I would defer to the Department of Revenue if they have a better answer, and I can always do some more research for the committee and get back to everyone.
Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you have data on each project and the subsidies that they receive? Is it possible to gather a list of that so we can kind of see, what percentage of each project got federal taxpayer subsidies, so to speak? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Ide, I currently don't have any information on that, but I can do some digging and get back to the committee.
Representative Lean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for preparing this and all the data that goes into it. While you were researching any of it, did you come across any research in Nebraska and the way that they handle their wind tax there?
Nothing that I can specifically speak to here or provide any sort of insight to. We did look into Nebraska's kind of tax structure. This is research from 2024. So some of the Nebraska, if the wind generation tax in Nebraska is new, we may not have information on that, but I can do some digging if you would like.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I would ask for you to produce that for us. And then while you're looking into it, would you also identify the policy markers in Wyoming that would need to be changed to have the Nebraska structure?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yes, of course, please.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm sorry I had misstated what I said before, but I do want to ask, would it be possible to, or do you have enough data, or can you get the data to do that assessment that says, to explain from cost per megawatt hour, or however you do it best, what is the most cost-effective power option? Is that even something that can be done relatively easy? I'm not trying to initiate a whole nother study, but if that data is available, that would be important. And then I know, as Senator Ide had asked for the subsidies, then overlaying that concept that says, if they go away, how does that impact that? And the reason I ask this question is because it has been said that it's critical that we infuse the wind and the solar into this. And in many cases, transmission to wind farms, to solar farms has landed smack on ratepayers' bills. I would refer to them as capital projects, but at the end of the day, they tend to land on the bill. So I'm trying to understand if they're saying, hey, it's because the wind generation's costs less per megawatt hour. I'd like to understand that to make sure when these things come up, we know how we can take an honest look at them and address them. So is that something you can do? Or anyway, your thoughts are appreciated either way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Locke, it's something I can definitely look into the feasibility of. With the individual cost of generation at these facilities, obviously there's going to be some unique factors coming into play. So think of a coal generation power plant. You're going to have to ship that coal to the plant. So depending on, where the plant is in relation to the mine that it's buying coal from could have an effect on all those different costs. But I can definitely look into options and see how feasible something like that is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Quilty. I was going to go back a little bit on your summary where it mentions the states surrounding us and what we produce and so on and so forth. So it highlights, of course, we generate more. I'm curious, another line back here where it highlights the states that actually outconsumed what they generate. And I guess I'm curious, is that reflected? I don't need it now. I'm just curious if that's reflected in any rate increases across all those states because of that lack of generation.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Riggins, I don't know off the top of my head if the nature of them being importers would lead to higher rates. My gut assumption would tell me yes, because you're paying for more power, that the users' rates would be higher, but I don't want to kind of for sure say anything. Let me look into that and I can send you an email.
Well, thank you. Just a minute. Co-Chairman Locke. He likes to wait till people get up.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to ask this. So if you could just briefly re-summarize, where do we stand on, and I may be stating this incorrectly, but in terms of the cost of the pricing when we put power on the grid, how does Wyoming do in comparison to these other states? Are we more expensive, less expensive? Is that a clear picture? Is that something that is easy to see? I would just be curious where we rate in terms of the cost of how we affect the cost of electricity on the grid at some level. And I don't know if that's even a real question, but your thoughts on that are appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't speak to how competitive we are for adding, say, 1 megawatt hour to the grid. If you look at all of our rates across kind of all of the major sectors, Wyoming in the Western United States plus, Wyoming does have the lowest overall sector prices for rates. So we do have, when compared to the kind of the Western states plus, we do have quote unquote cheap electricity. If that's kind of what you're getting at. But I don't think we went into, if we add 1 megawatt hour, how does that affect a ratepayer or anything like that?
Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick, have you ever seen a project proposed or completed that did not receive taxpayer subsidies? Just curious. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't speak to that in terms of either way. I would defer to the Department of Revenue on a question like that.
Thank you. Senator Case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I see we've let Mr. Kantowitz in and appreciate that. He's behind you on the screen, so we don't have a screen in front of us, but we're here to kind of talk big picture about some of the electricity issues, and I'd like to start off a little bit. As you know, Mr. Chairman, electricity is being taken up by about 4 different committees this session in the legislature. And the problems and the issues are kind of very interconnected. We have complaints from our customers, especially perhaps some of our larger customers, about rates, about availability. We have our citizens that are complaining about issues like the prevalence of renewable energy. There was a protest in front of the Capitol, I believe, last week about the development of the wind wall, they're calling it now, that runs, north and south in our state and sprawls clear over towards Carbon County. And the implications of that. Our larger legacy industries are also complaining about supply challenges. We're hearing about challenges in different communities to get electricity for economic development purposes. Mr. Chairman, these are all kind of connected. And the taxation policy is a tool that we could use to address some of these. And it's a policy that's pretty relevant because our taxation alternatives are really limited in Wyoming under our current thinking. We basically have two taxes, a property tax and a sales tax. Now, there is an income tax that we do have, and it's applied to our mineral industry. We don't call it an income tax, but it is a tax on the receipts from the production of minerals. But they're the only industry that pays it. And that's your ad valorem and your severance taxes. Those are really a form of an income tax, Mr. Chairman. They're very powerful taxes. And those legacy industries that pay those production taxes, they provide all the real taxes that make everything else we can talk about with respect to tax policy work in Wyoming. Without mineral taxes, we'd be the poorest state in the union. In our history, Mr. Chairman, we have been kind of a colony of the rest of the country. And a lot of the energy policy and other policies reflect this colonialism. Right here, right now, we are in the heart of the development of coal-fired electricity using Western coal, clean, low-sulfur coal that was promulgated and pushed by federal authorities in the late 60s and 1970s. And at that time, it was looking like the nation had its energy crisis. I don't know, some of you might remember the 1973 energy crisis, the 1978 energy crisis. And we had a plethora of federal policies to try to increase energy production in the United States. We wanted to make it cleaner. And so we were relying on low sulfur Western coal. That was an amazing time to be in Wyoming. And it was an amazing expansion in our population, on our economic basis. And our kind of forefathers did it right. They responded with policies. They responded with a severance tax. They responded with a program of industrial siting to try to get a handle of rampant growth, the impacts on our communities, impacts on our landscapes, to try to move money into communities early on in the process. They did a pretty good job when you look back on it. Today, our colonial experience is very similar. We are kind of, if you want, being the primary point in a federal energy policy that has shifted from fossil fuels to renewable, and maybe shifting back now, of course. I mean, I'm not unaware of what's happening now, but under previous administrations, we had policies, federal policies, that encouraged the use of our landscapes in the West and throughout the country, really, for renewables. The most heavily directed piece of that policy is called the Federal Production Tax Credit, which has been at various levels, but what it is it provides a credit and complete offsets to your tax obligation. It's not a deduction, it's a credit. So if you owe $100 in taxes, federal taxes on your renewable facility, but you have produced so much electricity that you qualify for a tax credit of upwards of 2 point some cents per kilowatt hour, that you can use to offset your tax obligation. That's a very powerful incentive. There are also other incentives as well. And that has resulted in significant development of renewables in Wyoming. That's changed the policy mix. For a while, it looked like coal was going to go away, Mr. Chairman. It's pretty scary. And we were looking at losing legacy industries that pay tons of taxes, employ people, give people good jobs, jobs with insurance. You know the drill. You live in the community, both of you. So wind doesn't quite do that. Solar doesn't quite do that. And they rely on the margins of the production tax credit to make the facilities work. Well, the production tax credit hasn't really gone away. And I would say that our federal position, we know what this administration brings. He's been very friendly to Wyoming. Grateful for that. We don't know what future administrations will bring. And we have not responded to the new federal development, the new energy crises in the same way that our forefathers did. We haven't responded with policies that'll help Wyoming to bridge to the future, whatever the future is. Our tax mix on electricity could do that. One piece of it is a tax on generation. You heard earlier, we export a lot of electricity. If we could get people in other states to help pay for electricity, pay those taxes, that's a positive thing for Wyoming. And we're going to hear from Mr. Kantowitz about how we can do that. Because when this was first proposed, we had legions of folks come up and say, you can't do it. You can't tax electricity exports. You cannot do it. And we have researched it. In 2024, we had the Corporations Committee requested an interim study of a generation tax possibility, Mr. Chairman. And there was a tax committee made up of 2 members from minerals, 2 members from revenue, and 2 members from corporations. We put out an RFP. We collected information, and one of the successful respondent to the RFP was Sterling. And Mr. Kantowitz is with Sterling. He's a tax expert in the highest level of practice. And he will talk about us. They analyzed whether we could do a generation tax and what the obstacles, the implications are, and the result was positive. And we're going to let him speak for himself. Generation tax isn't the only tool. Things kind of have to be integrated a little bit. Some of the other issues we're facing is, just adding straightly to the cost of producing electricity in Wyoming for all producers, including some who pay a lot of taxes, is really not a very good policy. So in our thinking, we've borrowed from the Wyoming Constitution where it talks about an income tax. The Constitution says we can put in an income tax. But if we do put in an income tax, we have to recognize and credit the taxpayer for the other state taxes they pay. Everybody said, well, that's a no-brainer. That's a killer for an income tax. Actually, that's not true. It does allow a tool to apply to companies that don't pay a lot of other taxes. It really is a tool. But in terms of just generation, if you think about the analogy with an income tax, having the ability to take our Wyoming other taxes paid and deduct them from the tax bill probably makes a lot of sense. That way, generation sources that already pay a lot of taxes, like coal, including the severance and the ad valorem, as it works through to a utility using that to produce electricity, is so they get a deduct for that. So their tax burden could be 0 if you dial in the taxes right. If you think about industries in Wyoming as people in a boat with their oars in the water, some of our industries have their oars in the water and they're pulling hard and they're contributing their fair share. Some of our industries don't. They take advantage of the fact that we have the lowest property taxes and low sales taxes and no income tax. Those oars are not in the water. This generation tax, properly applied, could help capture everybody, put their oars in the water and not hurt the legacy industries. Now, there's also a consumer issue. We have spent a lot of time coming up with kind of a fragmented policy with respect to property taxes. And I think we all agree that having all those pieces that don't necessarily fit together very well might have not have been our best thinking if we were to all start, you know. So I'm advocating that we approach the tax on generation by looking at the other electricity taxes that consumers pay and use it in a policy framework to attack some of the other issues we have right now, which are all interrelated. Here's one. We have had increases for our consumers with electricity, not as much as other states, but there was quite a bit of moaning and groaning about year 2004 or 2024 when the electricity tax study was coming underway. So we proposed that one option is to get rid of the sales tax on electricity, the retail sales tax on electricity. If you look at your electricity bill, it's right there. You pay the same retail sales tax as anybody else. So we thought, well, if we put in a generation tax, let's get rid of that tax so that basically ratepayers in Wyoming will not be impacted. Now think about it. We're adding a new tax on all electricity generated, including electricity that's exported and including domestic electricity. But we're getting rid of, or we could get rid of, the sales tax, which only our domestic consumers pay. In the end, it achieves a net tax revenue increase for people outside of Wyoming. And we can do that. And you're going to hear how we can do that. Now, in a world where people like my good colleague and friend, Senator Ide, talks about getting rid of property taxes and replacing with sales taxes, that may not be the best policy, because you could think of it as part of that mix of sales taxes that make up the property taxes. So maybe we need more discussion about that. But here's another piece. Sales taxes on electricity don't have to be equal. We can choose to direct policy by varying that tax. Mr. Chairman, the bill that was discussed about very large electrical loads is kind of an example of that policy. Very large electrical loads. There is a data center proposed in Cheyenne, Wyoming right now that off at the start will have an electrical, they will be producing electricity up to 2.7 gigawatts. Now, just to put that in perspective, the entire demand for Wyoming right now is about 1 gigawatt. All right? So this almost triples electricity produced and sold in Wyoming. Wow, that's huge. The sales taxes off those sales will go partly to the state and to the local government. That's huge. Nearly 3 times more than we produce now will go to one local government. Is that fair? Is that fair in a sense where all of us are looking for things like money for direct distribution for cities and towns? You know, we're all conservative. We didn't get rid of that. That's out there. How do we pay for that over the long time? This could be a way and still provide plenty of money for local governments in a sharing mechanism for these ultra-sized loads. The bill we talked about was over 100 megawatts. There's also, you could get rid of the sales tax on electricity for residential customers, but leave it in place for everybody else. So the policy tools, you know, the generation tax has been criticized because we gave all the money away. We got rid of the sales tax. You know, we kind of looked at a policy framework where we put a generation tax in, but then we make the counties, we get rid of the sales tax, but then we make the local governments whole with money from the generation tax. And it's sort of like we collected a big bunch of money, but we gave it all away, if you think about it, to make everybody happy. So the net wasn't that much. It was still a lot. 20, maybe 30 million. But if we think about the policies with respect to the offsets, then we can make that a much more powerful tax. And if we also think about how we apply the excise tax, the sales tax on electricity, we can achieve some other policy goals too, including like funding direct distribution and helping our state. Now, having everybody have their oars in the water is a good thing. It will, more than all the industrial siting processes, the protests in front of the Capitol, everything, it's a policy tool that will moderate the growth of renewables in Wyoming. It is a policy tool that could potentially moderate the rapid growth of data centers. Although I'm not really sure. Here's a problem we have in Wyoming. Data centers, they're ready to write checks for no matter how much. They don't care. That's why they can come in and have special tariffs and get power because they're willing to pay for it. Our legacy industries like the Trona fields, they're desperate. They want to expand. They only want 35 megawatts, maybe 70 megawatts. There's no capacity available. They don't have the ability to say, I'm willing to pay for it. It has to come through the kind of traditional utility mechanism. We could work on that too, because we need to nurture these legacy industries because they pay the taxes. Their oars are deepest in the water. And we could work on making, upgrading facilities across the state and providing low interest loans, for example, to help utilities expand their operations to supply oil and gas, Trona, other legacy industries, which every time we help them, we help ourselves because we get the revenues off severance and ad valorem. With that, I think we should let Mr. Kantowitz talk about his role in the tax study and the advice that he gave us. And we've always felt that this was going to be litigated. They won't like it if we go down this policy. But the truth is, it's a policy we can do. It can set Wyoming up for the next 100 years. It can make us as wise as Stan Hathaway and the other people that thought about the implications of the first round of federal energy policy that affected Wyoming and help us deal with the second round. And the new world of data centers and help our legacy industries. So I hope we think about this really hard, Mr. Chairman, and think about the interrelationships. We've never had a more powerful tool. We have an industry that has few taxpayers, really, in terms of utilities. That makes the administration kind of easy. We have great benefits that can be provided to our consumers, great sources of revenue, and there are policy reasons that might address a host of problems if we just use it right. So with that, maybe we can go to Mr. Kantowitz.
I have a quick question for you.
I'll do my best.
Since we're kind of all over the place with tax policy, it is kind of complicated. Well, what's your stand on the sales tax exemption for the data centers? Do you think that's a good thing or not a good thing?
Mr. Chairman, I have never voted for the manufacturing sales tax exemption. And it basically, you're sales tax free for new equipment for manufacturing. I don't think it's a good policy. I think the economic development people will tell you, well, that's essential because if we didn't have that, they wouldn't come here. I see data centers that they're building the facility, the newest big facility in Cheyenne, the 2.7 megawatt one, gigawatt one I was talking about. It doesn't even have a customer. But they're going to build a building, supply electricity, supply cooling, supply everything for a customer that they don't have yet. But they know the demand is so big that they're going to be able to do it. And you can't tell me that the sales tax is holding up someone from going in there after all the effort that they have to go through to do that. And cost is no object. That's why everything is in Black Hills territory. If those customers were in Rocky Mountain Power territory, the same things could happen, but there aren't any. Cheyenne is the center of the data center area, and I think they'd come if we got rid of that manufacturing tax exemption, or we just get rid of it for everybody but data centers. We don't have to be consistent. Or, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. If we got rid of it for the data centers, but didn't get rid of it for other classes of manufacturing, we don't have to be so broad brushed. Or cut it in half. I mean, it's not all or none. You guys gonna have to turn your chairs to see our good friend. Hello, Robert. Can't hear you. You're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you
There
very
you go.
much, Senator. I'm happy to participate in this and to summarize the main conclusions and analysis that we did about a year and a half ago. Let me, and I'll do it as I think at a reasonably high level that, you know, without getting into the weeds, obviously at some point, as you said, if it's litigated, if people challenge it, we have to get into details. And that includes, as you go forward drafting anything, taking everybody's concerns and comments into account. The basic limitations, if you want to call them that, on state tax policy when it comes to something like that are what's called the Dormant Commerce Clause and also a similar federal statute. Basically, the federal law says that you have to satisfy certain tests if you're going to impose a state tax on people that operate interstate. And the tests essentially are you have to apportion a tax fairly and not tax things that really have nothing to do with your state. That's sometimes referred to as external consistency. And then a more technical concept that's sometimes called internal consistency, which is you can't discriminate. You can't be in a situation where you are clearly treating internal taxpayers in your state better than external, or the other way around for that matter. So we thought about a production tax. We thought about and looked primarily at a tax that would be imposed on the production of electricity in Wyoming. And that tax can be measured in a number of ways. It can be measured by saying how much volume did you produce, how many kilowatt hours, and applying a rate to that. It can be measured by what is the value of what you produced. And in turn, if you measure it by what is the value of what you produced, you can say, okay, how many kilowatt hours did you produce? What's the value of a kilowatt hour? That's the value you produced in Wyoming, and that's the tax base. Or you can require going into the books and records of a producer and taking a look at gross receipts and trying to figure out how much of those gross receipts represented the value of production in Wyoming. And there are pluses and minuses. It's a little harder to figure out, what the concept is of a wellhead, if you will, for electricity, and how to apply a number and agree on a number. On the other hand, if you do that, you're looking directly at what was produced in Wyoming and saying, I know what the number is and we're going to tax it, as opposed to going into accounting records and trying to break out from gross receipts the costs of transportation of the electricity to other places and things like that. But that's the concept. Taxing production in Wyoming, no matter who does the producing in Wyoming. And our feeling is that that pretty clearly is not a discriminatory tax. It basically says if you come into Wyoming and you produce electricity in Wyoming, you pay a tax on that. The same as if you come into Wyoming, regardless of where you're headquartered, if you come into Wyoming and you extract minerals from the state, you pay a severance tax. And one thing we should also say is, and this gets into the question of whether or the extent to which modifications can be made at the same time or concurrently in a retail sales tax, which ultimately we think the answer is yes, but it's a more intricate question because what you cannot do is to say, okay, we're going to tax the production of electricity in Wyoming, but we're going to give you a credit against a bunch of other Wyoming taxes, because that would be a discrimination against out-of-staters who don't pay those other Wyoming taxes. But if you say you pay tax on the production of electricity in Wyoming, it doesn't matter where you sell it, whether you sell it here or you sell it there or any other state, you pay on the active production. That's a straightforward, non-discriminatory thing. Ultimately, our research points that you can, at the same time, reduce the retail sales tax for a few reasons, one of which is, and perhaps the best reason of which is, apart from the fact that the Supreme Court's cases are somewhat confusing, but the best reason is that the retail sales tax is not actually imposed on a producer. The retail sales tax is something that gets collected in the supply chain, ultimately by the supplier to the customer, but that's a tax on the customer. So our conclusion was, and again, this will have to be pressed and tested, our conclusion was that you can reduce a cost on a customer without running foul of the proposition that you're not discriminating against out-of-state producers when you say everybody who produces tax in Wyoming pays tax on that production. That's pretty much a summary of where we came out.
Representative Lean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for joining us today. My
you.
question for you would be, was there any fiscal note tied to any of this, or was this just the legalese that goes with the tax world?
When you say fiscal note, are you referring to numerical analysis?
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, and our tax study had two components. He was the legal guru, but a lot of the information you receive from our good staff came out of that tax study and other analysis that we made. So there's lots of analysis and number crunching of different scenarios, but Mr. Kantowitz wasn't involved in the number crunching. He was involved in whether we can do this, because people said we could not do this, that FERC rules would apply. The U.S. Constitution Commerce Clause would apply, that there were other reasons why we couldn't do this, and those reasons fell away.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I wanted to make sure I heard this correctly, because I may not have, so I apologize, Mr. Kantowitz. But you had mentioned that in the legal framework, if you apply one tax but take away other taxes, the implication of you're doing things different still remains. But it is my impression of this process that that's, to some degree, that's roughly what we're doing. We're talking about this new production taxation, but at a local level, we might consider the sales tax removal. And I just wanted to make sure, I'm not sure I heard that correctly, but I wanted to be clear on what that means from a legal perspective. Does that mean, are we crossing a line somewhere, or is that the framework that works?
We believe it, and as I said, it's new territory. There's no specific case in point, but this is based on, the case law that the Supreme Court has developed over the years. We believe that you would not be crossing a line into a prohibited area if you removed the retail or the sales tax on electricity that a consumer pays for buying electricity. that would not be discriminatory because that is not a tax on the producer. It's a thin line, but a lot of stuff in this area, in this what's called this dormant commerce clause area, has rested on thin lines. There were cases, for example, 2 cases involving bus lines. One case held that the tax had to be apportioned based on how many miles a particular trip was. And another case, 10 or 12 years later, the Supreme Court said that you didn't have to apportion it when you weren't taxing the bus line as an excise tax for driving the bus, but you were taxing the customer an excise tax for buying a ticket, or you're taxing the bus line's activity of selling a ticket. That you could tax the whole thing even though it was in interstate. So there's no case directly on point, but our judgment is that, at least based on what we're seeing, that you can make changes in your sales tax to the effect of alleviating the net cost that customers pay for electricity without being charged with discriminating against out-of-state producers who produce their electricity and pay a production tax in Wyoming and then ship their electricity to another state where there may or may not be a sales tax. So I hope that answers your question. The answer is we think it's okay.
This is just maybe just a little bit different question, but and this question probably impacts the number side of this, but let's just talk about it in the legal framework, because one of the things I think I heard from Mr. Quilty and the data from the report was that there are other states imposing a similar tax. So this has been done at least at some level by these other states. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, most states impose some kind of tax. It's may not be a generation tax. It may be they have income taxes. They have other types of taxes. We actually have low taxes on electricity production. Really, we do. And I think the staff analysis was real well done. Maybe you could reaffirm the kind of the issue about the plethora of other states' practices.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Case. Yeah, so Wyoming is one of 9 of the Western states plus that does not have a gross receipts tax. So this would be if you include the total of the 11 Western states and the 3 additional states. So out of the 14 Western plus states, 9 of them, including Wyoming, don't have a gross receipts tax.
And then there are other taxes on electricity as well.
Yeah, yes. And those would be, every state would have some version of electrical taxation. So even the ones like Wyoming that don't have a gross receipts tax likely have something else.
Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. That helps a lot. I just wanted to understand who else is doing it. It sounds like 5 out of 14 are doing it. I just wanted to get a feel for that, but thank you.
I think when you actually drill down, everybody has some kind of tax. When you really look at it, it might come about through property taxes. For example, Nebraska, which was brought up earlier, has a tax on the production nameplate capacity of generation units, especially renewable generation units. It's over $3,000 a megawatt per year. Just different ways they do taxes. Montana has local impact taxes on that go to the local governments. So looking at how states treat taxes on electricity or electricity generation or electricity facilities, every state does something, and it's varied. In Wyoming, we're on the light side because of our low property taxes, lack of income or gross receipts taxes, and reasonable sales taxes. So we're on the light side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator. When I looked at this last year, I know that, and I'm just looking at the summary now, and it highlights, allows generators to credit all the other taxes they paid. And the net result, by the time it was all over, I think it estimated 19 million in this particular scenario. Considering the administrative duties, I just felt after that point, it wasn't worth that much work for the difference. And would the new proposal modify that formula? Is it going to be, I mean, is that those credits going to be less because we take some of the taxes off of it? And suggesting like in the sales tax, they wouldn't be applying that. That was my take as I looked through this for a while. It was just a lot of work. And I didn't know if it was really going to generate that much more income than we can with some of the other traditional ways we're doing it right now. That was my thoughts.
So, Mr. Chairman, to address that head on, I think that's just absolutely wrong. And I'll tell you why. Administratively, it's pretty simple because you have a few number of taxpayers. They're called electric utilities or other power producers. There's not that many. There's not 1,000. There might be 100. That drops your administrative burden down. As our good Secretary of State likes to say, is the juice worth the squeeze? I've heard that a few times. Remember, that's based on what size you make the gross receipts tax. In a world where we're going away from property taxes, could we have a higher? Because the deducts are already fixed. The amount of severance, I doubt if we're going to change and increase severance taxes on coal. So that's a fixed, it's variable in the sense it varies by production, but the level of tax per unit is fixed. And so that's not going to change. So if you raise the gross receipts or the generation tax up 1%, you've already covered in all the other deducts. They're not going to get any bigger. The deducts don't get any bigger. So you raise it up, then all of a sudden you're in a gravy world. Another piece of that, and good representative, is how we treat local governments with respect to the sales tax. We didn't have a world of data centers coming into our state before. We didn't have mega loads. All of a sudden, mega loads give us a revenue source that's a huge tool in this whole equation, which we should think about. But basically, we had said, well, let's get rid of sales taxes on everybody, and let's continue to pay counties and local governments for their lost sales tax revenue, because we know the sales there by the 100 providers. So we'd used up a lot of that tax, but we also kept the level of that tax low. And once every piece, the marginal impact is huge, but only, and because all the deducts would stay the same. And frankly, it's good policy that we recognize these legacy industries and the taxes they already pay and the ores that they already have in the water. In the end, we'd like to maybe not impact them at all. So I disagree that it's not worth it. That was a slice, and there's just so many more policy ramifications. And what's also worth it is the fact that this is a tax that adjusts over time. Let's say in 50 years, 30 years, 20 years, we produce less coal and more electricity comes from other sources. This tax accounts for that. And in fact, if the inputs from Wyoming reduce over time, the net gain in the tax increases over time, which is really good policy for us and makes it flexible, gives us something we can plan on that's predictable. And so don't go down that road quite yet of saying it's not worth the squeeze.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was thinking maybe, I think I read in the study last year, I think Idaho implemented a gross receipts tax on this same, I don't know how it turned out for them. I guess I'd be interested to have a review of that, information down the road. And then the second thing, do you see it staying at this percentage at 3.5? I thought I thought maybe last year, I thought it'd have to be like 4.5 or a little bit higher number to make up a little more difference. Thank you.
That's probably true, Mr. Chairman, especially if we decide what we want to do with the credits to the tax. Remember, the credits won't increase, but if you go up 1%, sales tax in most communities, I would venture to guess is 6. Maybe some of them are higher. So if we got rid of a portion of that, and then yet we got revenue from people out of state that don't pay these taxes now, that's very powerful. And so they could probably afford 4, 4.5, 5. It's still good policy, and it gets very powerful.
Representative Wharf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering, I see we have a copy of Senate File 76. There's no fiscal note. I'm assuming that there was a fiscal note associated with that bill. Do you recall what that ballpark, what that did, Senator Case?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I don't do numbers anymore. There have been a lot of Bill 77s in my life. Can you be more specific which bill we're talking about?
Mr. Chairman, I'm talking about Senate File 76, which is the bill that's in our packet. It is the one that talks about the distribution of taxes on large electrical loads sponsored by you.
Okay, that was a bill, Mr. Chairman, from last year.
Yes, that's correct.
I don't recall, was there a fiscal note on it?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
sir, Mr. Chairman. Senator Case, and Representative Wharf, if you look at packet page 163, the fiscal note is attached. It should be like the very, in the online electric packet, excuse me. It was part of the attachments for kind of the wide memorandum that I discussed earlier.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, just looking at this real quick. It says the DOR estimated the sales tax attributable to large load customers to be 7.7 million. I assume that's annual. Look what's happened since this was written. There is one data center being constructed in Cheyenne right now that is almost 3 times, will use electricity and produce electricity 3 times the entire state of Wyoming. And we're about 1 gigawatt in production. Okay. And that's capacity. That's not, every time you produce a gigawatt for an hour, that's gigawatt hour, and that's what's taxable. If you produce a gigawatt for 24/7 all year long, that's an enormous amount of electricity, which data centers tend to have pretty steady demand. That's enormous amount of electricity, which sells, they're buying that electricity. Even when it's an in-house deal, the Black Hills tariff, Black Hills in the middle of that, and the people develop the data center, they build the power capability, they get Black Hills in on the deal, and then they have someone come, and that person that comes pays for the electricity. Is it 5 cents per kilowatt hour? I don't know. It's probably higher than that because it's mostly natural gas fired, and it's also going to be fuel cells, which are going to be more expensive. Maybe some of the higher, so maybe it's 10 cents, Mr. Chairman. And then you figure that times almost 3 times the load of the state of Wyoming every day, constantly, and you apply a tax to that, it's a bunch of money.
Representative Lean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Case. My question would be, how does this affect net metering? Was that a part of the conversation at all?
Never, Mr. Chairman, because there's no sales to the utility. The utility doesn't buy the power and then sell it back. It's just an offset, so it does not affect net metering. Doesn't have, and in fact, if a customer owned their own generation and supplied it to themselves, didn't buy it, wasn't a transaction, they wouldn't be covered either.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator, because this is, I'm enjoying the education here, so I appreciate it. So my oversimplified brain, when I was listening to Mr. Quilty's analysis, we consume 35% versus 65% that gets shipped out. So when I look at this concept, the concept, if I'm reading this right, whatever the number is, the theoretical magic is, now we're 2/3 is being shipped out, for lack of a better term. I have kind of 2 questions on that. One is the detail in the report enough for us to understand what we have to, how we would address that impact to local people, right? Our local customers, our consumers, because I think most of us are like, we're not going to raise their rates anymore. We've hammered them pretty hard in the last two and a half years. That's a kind of a given on that. The second piece of that is now that affects, I'm going to use the wrong term here, our competitiveness for our power price on the grid, or however you want to look at that. You probably understand that. You obviously understand that much better than me. Can you kind of explain that first piece? Do we understand the numbers well enough to say, well, here's what the number is and here's how we would address it locally? And the second piece is, does that affect our competitiveness with the power that we are selling? I'm just curious how that works, because I have heard somewhere where the people using this gross receipts states using this gross receipts approach have not been received favorably. I don't know if that's accurate. I've heard that in the wind. Your thoughts are appreciated, sir.
I'll do my best. To start at the top of the equation is Wyoming's electric rates are relatively low. They're some of the lowest in the country. Our residential are some of the lowest in the country. We have that base to build on. It is true that about the time this was being discussed in 2024, there were back-to-back electrical rate increases proposed. And you were part of that. We were at those public hearings and people were pretty angry and hot. So I think that's one of the genesis of saying, well, you know, we don't have to hit those people as hard if we tax electricity more, because we can reduce, we do have a tool, which is the sales tax on electricity. We could use that tool. We still can. In terms of a situation with the West right now, in terms of electrical generation, you've got 2 outliers. You've got Oregon and Washington that have a tremendous amount of hydro. And even though they have policies that have driven up the cost of electricity, they still really rely on that hydroelectric power, which is incredibly cheap. So they're kind of outliers. You got to throw them out of the equation. We have an outlier in Wyoming, which is Lower Valley. I think it's the one that serves Teton County. They have a connection to the hydros of the Northwest because of their proximity to the Snake River, and that flows into the Columbia system. And so, so they're super low prices. But everybody else in Wyoming is on the lower end of the country, but really lower. And compared to things like, look at California. I can't even begin to tell you, but I should have looked it up. But somebody look up the average retail or residential price per kilowatt hour of electricity in California. It'll blow your socks off. And they're kind of stewing in their own mess because of the policies they've driven and the fact they can't locate new generation. And they don't want the generation that works. You couldn't build a coal plant in California. It'll never happen, could never happen. Gas plants also face severe restrictions. You have a commitment from the state to go away from fossil fuels completely by the early 1940s. I keep doing the wrong century. That shows how old I am, the 2040s. Even if we increased electricity in Wyoming, say modestly, the price, it's still in a capacity short West. I can't tell you how short we were this winter. If we would have had a normal winter, we could have been in real trouble with the grid. We need more generation, reliable, dispatchable generation. And we're suffering from policies where new generation sources, while they're free on the margin because when the wind blows, it's free, it's very expensive to integrate into our electric grid. And so if we can move away from that and more solidify reliable generation, we're going to be in a better position in the West to sell electricity. There will also potentially be able to sell Eastern. There are people looking at technologies to put in a DC intertie to allow electricity to possibly move to the East now, which could have significant impacts on the markets. But I don't think, the bottom line of your question, that a modest electricity tax, generation tax, will have severe reflection of Wyoming's competitiveness as one of the biggest net exporters of electricity in the country and then in the West. It's just people need us. They're locked into long-term contracts. They can't build facilities, and they can cite renewables which don't meet the entirety of their needs. And here we are. It could be a new golden age.
On that note, I think we'll take about a 15-minute break till 10:45 and then open it up for public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee.
We'll open this up for public comment.
Good morning, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Nick Stoffel. I'm a partner with the law firm of Holland and Hart, appearing today on behalf of the Wyoming industrial energy consumers. I think as many of you know, WYEC includes many of the largest industrial customers in Wyoming on Rocky Mountain Power System, and represents some of the Trona customers, the oil and gas customers that Senator Case mentioned earlier have some of the deepest oars in the water in terms of their contributions in tax revenue in this state. I'd like to take a moment to just talk about kind of the tax policy questions around increasing taxes on the generation or consumption of electricity in Wyoming. I think these tax policy conversations to me are very interesting. Perhaps I'm a bit odd that way. When I went in law school, all of my electives were tax policy. So I got a kick out of these conversations. And at its core, it seems like the conversation we're having today involves two questions, really. Can we do the kind of taxation that is being discussed? And should we? And we heard earlier from Mr. Kanowitz that it sounds like pretty definitively we can tax all generation production in Wyoming. And we think we might be able to create an offsetting reduction in the tax revenue on sales tax so that customers in Wyoming at least are not harmed, that they're break even with that tax change. It didn't sound like we have a definitive answer on that. There's no clear line. It sounds like both Senator Case and Mr. Kanowitz fully expect that that issue would be litigated. And ultimately, it'd be a court that would answer the question of, can we do this? But I really kind of want to talk about, should we do this? And so when you think about, should we increase taxes on the production of electricity in Wyoming? I'm kind of curious the assumptions that are underlying that type of policy, and really the assumptions around, well, who's going to pay? And so first you could have the expectation, I think as was discussed, that initially all customers of generation from Wyoming will bear that increased tax. Well, maybe it's not customers, right? If it's the customers, we're assuming their provider is flowing through that additional cost as part of their cost of providing service. I think that's probably a fair assumption to make. Alternatively, you're imposing an unrecoverable tax on their providers that ultimately will increase the utility's cost of capital and increase their cost of providing service in an indirect way. And so I think it's important to think that you have both the direct burden of the tax, or are customers going to be paying for the tax itself? Open question. Or are they going to pay the indirect effects if they're not paying that tax, because it's going to impact their provider's creditworthiness and ability to attract capital and ability to provide service at the lowest possible cost over the long term? The other thing that I think is important to bring up in the context of this conversation is an evolution in the electrical markets in our region. And this evolution has really occurred this year in another step with Rocky Mountain Power, Pacificor, joining the extended day-ahead market, which is a federally regulated market that connects sellers and buyers of electricity to optimize the price paid in any given hour. And what does that mean? In simple terms, is it means all generators bid into the market, and the marginal unit, the most expensive unit needed to serve customers, sets the market-wide price. And so if that market-wide price, that bid includes a generation tax, it's going to increase the cost market-wide. And then all load purchases from the market at that market clearing price. And so I think it's really important to bear in mind that in the West, we are really moving into these regional market constructs, whether it be Markets Plus with SPP, whether it be the extended day-ahead market under the California ISO, and that the market price of electricity really is a regional market now. It's not a state-specific market. And so a policy like increasing taxes on the generation of electricity in Wyoming should be expected to put upward pressure on that regional market price that ultimately impacts all customers. And so with kind of that understanding of the market and the potential impacts on customers, WYEC really believes that increasing taxes on electricity is counter to the idea of promoting affordability or accessibility of electricity for customers in Wyoming and in the surrounding states. And it's counter to really the kind of competitive role that I understand Wyoming wants to play in maintaining its role as a net energy exporter, because it really now is a regional marketplace that you'd be competing in. For those reasons, Wyatt continues to oppose the imposition of taxes on generation in Wyoming, and appreciate the opportunity to provide these comments today. Happy to answer any questions.
Representative Riggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and is it Boffel?
Stoffel.
Stoffel.
Thank you.
So I mentioned earlier about the generation tax in Idaho. Am I correct on that? Do they have or did they ever pass one? Or maybe they never got it off the ground, but I thought they had.
Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that specifically, so I can't answer that one.
Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll have to ask again, Stoffel, is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Stoffel, thank
Yes.
you. Yeah, thanks for your testimony. I tend to have some of your same thoughts there. You mentioned earlier the might part of it, the benefit to the consumer. Could you give a little more detail on that?
Well,
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. As I understood the conversation earlier between Senator Case and Mr. Kanowitz, that it sounded like an across-the-board tax on generation in Wyoming that applies to all generators equally, did not have questions around its legality, did not have questions around whether it'd be susceptible to legal challenge on its own. The question came up around an offsetting change on sales tax to provide customers in Wyoming relief from those taxes. And that's where the question about, does this actually achieve the objective that you're talking about, increasing revenue to the state without actually increasing the burden on Wyoming residents? Does that hold? And it sounded like that part of the legal analysis is where it was the most susceptible and may or may not play out as you hope. And it sounded like Senator Case and Mr. Kanowitz both recognized it's highly likely to be tested and ultimately decided in a court rather than just through the legislature. So that was the basis of my comment about it. It might work out.
Well, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thanks so much for the opportunity to comment. My name is Kara Choquette. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Government Relations for the Power Generation and Transmission Affiliates of the Anschutz Corporation. The Anschutz Corporation is a large, diversified energy company. You know us best here, especially in Campbell County, through Anschutz Exploration Corporation, which is the largest taxable value mineral production taxpayer in the state of Wyoming. We've been following this issue for a long time. I know you've heard from me before, so I won't try to belabor the points, although there's a lot of points to be made. The main thing I wanted to communicate to this committee was to remind you of the good news, especially as it relates to Table 2 of the excellent economic analysis prepared by the Wyoming Legislative Service Office. And that's the one that looks at what are the taxes being received from wind, coal, and natural gas. I think for the purposes of a state tax policy discussion, we really should stay focused on state taxes. The federal production tax credit, for example, is available to all projects around the country, or it used to be. That's probably gone away now due to the Big Beautiful Bill. One of the good things, though, certainly about the Big Beautiful Bill, is that it finally brought into reality a provision that we have been advocating for since 2016 and 2017. And that is the federal revenue sharing of federal fees and rents that we pay for our project, which is located in part on federal lands. So if you look at that Table 2 chart and you look at the state share of taxes, right now, wind is credited or estimated to pay $2.29 per megawatt hour of electricity production. That's essentially the same as coal. If you look at just the state share of what the state tax policy leads for coal, it's $2.30 a megawatt hour. So that's effectively the same. But coal and natural gas then are given credit for the share of things that they pay at a federal level that come back to the state of Wyoming. And effective this year, the state of Wyoming and Carbon County is going to be receiving money from our project. We estimate that a minimum, that's going to add another $1. So if there was a subtotal 3 for federal mineral, or in this case, we're non-mineral royalties, that would add another $1, bringing us to, on average, $3.29 per megawatt hour. So this goes back to the conversation where we started with generation tax again back in 2016. And we talked with the Revenue Committee at that time and said, rather than adding more taxes on electricity made in Wyoming, increasing the risks that these kind of projects can be successful, disincentivizing the business of power generation in the state of Wyoming, let's work together and get a greater share of the revenues that we already plan to pay through the federal royalties. And so we're so pleased that that will now be happening again starting this year. So 25% of the money that we pay now in all wind and solar projects on federal lands, 25% of the money that we pay now will be coming back to you as a state, and 25% is coming back specifically to Carbon County or whatever county is hosting these federal lands projects. So that's really good news and something to think about if this table is important to you as part of the decision making. I would like to address some of the questions that were brought up today, if that's helpful. I know there was a question about Idaho. Idaho does have a generation tax. I believe it's in lieu of other taxes. And also, if you look at the amount of generation in the 10 WEC states and then the additional Western Plus states that the LSO talked about, Idaho is last with the amount of power generation. I have shared this data with you before. As of 2024, there's a question about how much solar do we have? The amount of coal production, electricity production was 24.3 million megawatt hours. Wind was 9.0 million megawatt hours. Natural gas, 5.4. So again, looking at your table, natural gas provides the most per megawatt hour in state taxes, but also is one of the lower amounts of electricity production. We as Anschutz are actually working on a project to try to change that and bring more natural gas production to the state. And then solar is 423,149 megawatt hours. The last thing I just want to mention about the legal analysis, I heard, and maybe others heard it differently, but I heard the legal analysis, him saying you can't discriminate. And we would certainly agree with that. And he also said, if you tax the production of all electricity, you cannot have those credits back because that would apply only to in-state and that would be a discriminatory tax policy. So I think that's a question to consider very carefully, because if you're adding $1 or $2 or gross receipts tax, whatever it is, that's adding on to already a very significant amount of money that's paid by the electric power generation industry. You know, the electric energy dominance is expressed in a number of ways. It's the fuel for power, it's power. You know, we certainly operate as a company, both in the mineral space. The power generation and transmission companies are in the non-mineral energy space. We know full well that this cannot at all approach the amount of revenue that the mineral industry brings to Wyoming. No new non-mineral industry can. It's like saying, hey, you guys should be able to provide as much protein as a steak. And I'm like, hey, I'm selling an apple. There's no way I can provide that much protein, but I can provide something. And so I just close with a comment that really struck me from our Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, when he was in Congress testifying last month about a proposal that would add taxes on the oil and gas companies. And he said, if you tax something, you get less of it. And I think getting less energy is not a good strategy. And I would suggest that is also true for the state of Wyoming. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for coming here again. I know you kind of went through a lot of data quickly, so I apologize. I wanted to back you up to your statement about the process that's going to start allowing the wind component to put more into the, for lack of a better term, state and county coffers. Can you talk through that just a little bit, just to make it clearer for those of us who are learning as we go? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Locke, thank you so much for the question. Yes, I am so personally excited about this provision. In 2016, we talked about this idea with the Revenue Committee. The Revenue Committee did agree to jointly sponsor a resolution that was passed by the full legislature in the 2017 session and signed by the governor, that was sent to the entire federal delegation, that called for 50% of the federal fees and rents paid by wind and solar and federal land to come back to the state, just like it happens for essentially 50% for other resources in the state. You know how hard it is for the state to change or affect federal laws. So that was in 2017. Since that time, we have tried to uphold our end of the bargain, as it were. We have testified, we have spoken to our congressional delegation. We went to the Energy Council and asked for a resolution of support. The Wyoming County Commissioners have been very supportive on this, have sent letters over time as different bills have come forward to try to provide a vehicle. We got really close one year with 2 pieces of companion legislation in the Senate and the House that just failed at the last moment. And over these years, it evolved such that 25% goes to the state and 25% to the county. And so that change, it was part of a bill for a number of years called the Public Lands Renewable Energy Development Act. Most of the rest of that act didn't go anywhere. That provision got picked up and put in the big, beautiful bill. I personally was in the office of Representative Hageman and Congressman Gosar, who was a big advocate for getting this in the big, beautiful bill. And so that provision is of the big, beautiful bill, section 50303, if anyone wants to look it up, renewable energy revenue sharing. And it says, beginning on January 1st, 2026, the amounts collected from a renewable energy project as bonus bids, rentals, fees, or other payments under a right-of-way permit, lease, or other authorization shall be deposited in the general fund of the Treasury and without further appropriation or fiscal limitation be allocated as follows. And then it's 25% to the state where the project is and 25% to the county. The legislation says the timing is, it shall be made available in the fiscal year that immediately follows the fiscal year for which the amounts were collected. So because it's a new process, I don't know exactly how the BLM plans to implement that, but if the fiscal year starts in October, presumably whatever monies would have been paid by, there's not a lot of federal wind and solar in Wyoming. There is, a little bit more in the West, but presumably that would start to show up, I would think, in the next fiscal year, starting October 1.
Representative Lean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for joining us today. My question is about the federal liabilities as far as an income tax credit goes. I understand that this is what everyone refers to as subsidies. And when you work in the wind industry, are you familiar with Nebraska and how they're taxed on their wind versus Wyoming?
Mr. Chairman, at a high level, I am. And I know that in lieu of other taxes, they put in like a per megawatt of capacity fee of somewhere around $3,500. So if you had a 3,000 megawatt wind project times 3,500, that would be your annual taxes paid per year.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The way that I understand wind to work is that there's an excise tax that's paid in Wyoming for the privilege of using our wind to generate electricity. When I'm looking forward to and exploring the option of an electricity generation tax, I'm curious to know what does that look like for subsidies in the current landscape of the wind turbines in the area that you work? Do you have to reapply for them? How often do you reapply for them? And do they make it so that your wind turbines function in the state of Wyoming? Would you function without them?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lean, those are great questions. In general, the federal tax credit is a federal tax credit, so it applies equally. So when you're really looking at those state-to-state comparisons, or I'm competing against a project in another state, what it comes down to then is those other costs, state taxes obviously being one of them. So we only have the one wind project in Carbon County. Power Company Wyoming is very unique in that it's a single project developer, so the project happens in Carbon County or it doesn't happen at all.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we're looking at the 3-year exemption on windmills, could you clarify for me, if a new company comes in and purchases your wind turbines, are they then at a 3-year exemption as well for the first 3 years of them producing wind? Or is it just the first 3 years of the existing wind turbines when they're built?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lean, again, you do your homework. These are great questions. So my understanding of the statute is that the grace period for turbines, the first 3 years is the turbines themselves, not the owner of the project. So after a turbine has been in operation for 3 years, then it starts to pay the generation tax of $1 per megawatt hour. And the reason why the legislature did that back in 2010 was back in 2008 and 9, the only taxes that a wind power project had to pay was property taxes. And it is industrial property taxes taxed at the 11.5% rate. Then the 2009 legislature removed the sales and use tax exemption. And so there had been a sales and use tax exemption that added a 6%, at least for us in Carbon County, a 6% upfront, which is really, a little more difficult to absorb when you're building these big capital intensive projects to have this upfront cost right away. So then the 2010 legislature, when they were considering this generation tax, they looked at, okay, so the local governments are getting money annually from property taxes that funds local governments, schools, state general fund, et cetera. The local governments now are getting upfront money in the form of the sales tax, because when you pay that sales tax, you get it to the Department of Revenue, they get it turned around like within a month or something. They're very efficient there. So the local governments needing additional tax money, the idea was that's like the frosting on the cake. So you've gotten off as a developer, you've paid these really big property taxes because you have the highest assessed valuation in those first 3 years, this really big load of all the capital costs of building the wind power project. So the idea was that they're kind of trying to balance local governments are getting upfront money, the developer is getting a little bit of a break, and that you don't pay this generation tax until the 3rd year after you come off of kind of some really big upfront capital costs. So the generation tax started in 2012, and since that time, cumulatively, the state of Wyoming has gained over $66 million from that frosting on the cake. That's on top of, as I talked about at your August meeting last year, hundreds of millions of dollars in property taxes, and certainly more hundreds of millions of dollars in sales and use taxes over time. The way that the tax is distributed, the state of Wyoming has gotten over $26 million, Converse County has gotten over $17 million, and Carbon County is approaching 10. So the tax is distributed 60% to the counties, and I think this is coming up on your agenda. I'm probably getting ahead, based on percent of assessed valuation in the county, with 40% going to the state general fund. Sorry, I'm nerdy and I get into these topics, so.
Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask you, Ms. Choquette, to clarify for me what you were saying about the tax credits that I believe were part of the idea behind HB 300 from 2025, and that saying that that whole idea of taxing on the gross earnings and then getting the tax credit back for some producers is not really viable. Is that what I heard?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, that's what I heard from the legal counsel, is that you can tax the production of all electricity, but you cannot do the offsetting credits because that would apply only to in-state credits. So for example, if you were giving a tax credit for coal bought in Wyoming, that would be discriminatory because what if the power plant wanted to buy coal from Montana? I think that's what he was getting at. So I heard it as you have to add the tax on all of it. There'd be no offsetting credits or you would be discriminatory. And he said very clearly, you cannot discriminate.
Mr. Chairman, that's absolutely incorrect. And maybe Mr. Kotowicz is still on. That is absolutely incorrect.
Mr. Chairman, follow up?
Go ahead.
Yes. I believe that the legal study was supposed to be released publicly, and maybe there's still confusion because it hasn't been. Is that correct?
Probably a good bet. Really don't have an answer. Eve, is he still on?
He is on now, Mr. Chairman.
I'm on now. Just to address that, what I was saying is that there is case law that says that if a state imposes a new tax and gives an offset to people who pay that new tax against what they're paying on other in-state taxes, is case law that says that that would be discriminatory because you're telling people who are paying taxes in-state on other in-state activities that they're not going to have to pay any additional net, whereas people from out of state don't get that credit. It is fact dependent, and that's why, for example, our conclusion was that alleviating the sales tax on electricity didn't fall in there because the sales tax is not a tax on the producer, it's a tax on the consumer. And I'm not quite sure that I'm catching every suggestion, but I would tell you that a lot of this stuff is very hard. It's hard to parse the Supreme Court decisions beyond what the decisions actually say on their facts. But any proposal has to be analyzed in the light that there are things you can do that entail people from out of state paying taxes on activities in state. That's permissible. But there's certain other things you can't do to sort of with the left hand give back what was taken away with the right hand, where it structurally can only be given back to in-state taxpayers.
And Mr. Chairman, for Mr. Conowitz, the part of the question was with regard to the other credits for like coal severance or property taxes paid. And the issue there becomes that those credits apply to the electricity that goes out of state as much as they apply to the electricity that goes in state. You're not discriminating between the two, if you think about it. So if a coal company produces electricity or a utility produces electricity with coal, some of that goes out of state, some of that stays in state, but the credit applies to everything that it produces. And Robert, that was the piece that was also part of the question.
Yeah.
Representative Storr, I would just echo what Wyack said. The legal question is certainly one part of this discussion, but I think the economic facts and the strategic facts show this adding more taxes or disincentivizing the production of electricity in Wyoming is not a good idea for the long-term future of Wyoming. And the, excuse me, the RFP does say that the document will release to the public, but I don't think it has been yet.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this, I apologize, but this might be the Senator Case. Just making sure I understood. So the credits, because in that process, it was my understanding that severance, I'll just use severance as one of the options. Due to the fact, it was my impression that that was kind of, I shouldn't use the offset concept, but the credit would potentially be given on severance tax. But because all of the generation of that electricity for coal and gas, for example, is going everywhere, theoretically, that is not discriminatory. Is that, am I hearing that correctly? Thank you. Okay, that I just wanted to be clear in my head because I thought that was there, but I wasn't sure.
Well, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, members of the committee, Brett Fanning, Director of the Wyoming Department of Revenue. A couple questions in there throughout the morning that I just wanted to add some tidbits. Again, the Department of Revenue It's a policy decision on whether or not the legislature would like to enact some sort of generation tax. But it is important to note that we do have generation tax already in Wyoming. So we have the wind generation tax, right? And we technically potentially have a nuclear generation tax as well. So I just wanted to make that note. I think that kind of got lost in the conversation a little bit. I had a couple questions related to fiscal notes and kind of how that impacts all of this. Really, there have been two approaches for this in my tenure in doing fiscal notes here. The first one is kind of on the earnings that's produced from the electrical generation. And so this is where we look at the Wyoming Constitution. And in the Constitution, it says if you're going to have a tax on earnings, tax on income, for lack of a better term, you've got to be able to credit sales tax, use tax, and ad valorem tax. Now, in Senator Case's proposal, in one of his proposals, there was the addition of severance tax in there as well. And that was based on testimony and feedback that he's likely received over the past couple of years. The Department of Revenue had a challenge in estimating that potential credit. Because remember, the severance tax is paid by our industry, our mineral industry. This electrical generation tax would be paid by a producer. And so you're looking at kind of an indirect severance tax there. And that was a challenge that we did have in generating the fiscal note. Now, when we're talking about the previous House Bill 300, and we were talking about the 3.5% on earnings, when you look at that, and we used federal data, we found an average kilowatt price at collaboration with LSO. There was about a $3.8 billion figure as it relates to earnings. And this fiscal note's old, so it's hard to tell how that's morphed over the past couple of years. And so then when you take 3.5% of that $3.5 billion, that's where you get into the ballpark of the $130 million figure that we had. That's without any sort of credit. Without any sort of credit, we were starting at 130 million. But then if you look at the Constitution, you remove sales tax that they've paid, remove any use tax that they've paid. And again, those are very similar, sales and use tax. And then you look at property taxes that they've paid. And then with the addition of the, I'll say, indirect severance tax, just for lack of a better term, that's where you came down into the Department of Revenue and LSO's fiscal note is you're looking at $20 million. Now, the indirect severance tax is not outlined in the Constitution. Something to consider. Again, we've talked about different percentages, something to consider. Again, the Department of Revenue, it's a policy decision, but those are just kind of aspects that we've heard. So you've got the earnings. The second one we've had over the past couple of years is on kind of a unit. And that's really what we do with our wind generation tax right now. On a unit, it's $1 per unit. It's $5 per unit. Another potential avenue. How does that impact what the language says in the Constitution and what can be deducted? So really, there's been two approaches to this over the past few years in various iterations. One, you look at some sort of earnings that come from the electrical generation or the units that come from the generation. So I just kind of wanted to clarify that. And if there's any questions before I go on to some of my other points, I'd be happy to answer those.
Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Fanning. Excuse me. You kind of hit on that it's kind of circular on, and my question to you is, technically speaking, the Department of Revenue, do you classify or how is it classified, the severance tax? Is it considered a corporate income tax on the basis of your definition? Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, outstanding question. We just considered a severance tax. You will hear it in discussions that it is a form of income tax, but I'm gonna shy away from the question only because in our statutes we consider it a severance tax, and that's basically for the right to sever it from the ground. I'm going to shy away from the question just because I know of the nomenclature that comes from that. But yes, It is a tax that they pay based on the value that they generate from severing minerals from the ground in Wyoming.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple more points. I know we're kind of running on. This whole discussion really centers upon, so state of Wyoming, so blessed with our mineral industry, right? And we send so much of that out of state. So much of it. I've heard anywhere from 65 to 75% of the electricity that we generate, we ship elsewhere. When you ship it elsewhere, you can't collect sales tax on it. And we've heard some of that legal description as well. So when it goes out of state, when it goes outside of your jurisdiction, can't collect sales tax on it. And so that's why this committee in the past and along with Senator Case has developed ways to try and capture some of that revenue that's really going outside our state. So just something to consider. You know, we talked about the manufacturing exemption earlier this morning as well. A lot of those items, not all, but a lot of those items are shipped out of state. So the state of Wyoming doesn't realize revenue on that because it doesn't have any sort of tax on income, for lack of a better term, or tax on earnings. So when you ship something out of state, you can't collect sales tax on it. And I think that's important, an important concept to note as this discussion is going on.
Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Penny, you say we can't collect sales tax when we ship it out of state. Can we collect a export tax on that by when we ship it out of state?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, not the right person to ask. My apologies. Again, that's a legal mind. And we may have some legal counsel in the room or still on the screen. But again, when it leaves your jurisdiction, you lose some of the right and the taxing power to tax on those earnings. Okay. Mr. Chairman, just a couple more. Thank you so much. So again, not piggybacking too much into the next topic, but so talking about wind, solar, nuclear generation. And so we do have the tax on wind. Okay, we all know that. No tax on solar as it currently amounts. And then kind of have a tax on nuclear generation. And that's why I wanted to point out this. There was a proposal last year from this committee to decrease the nuclear generation tax from 5 down to 1. And there were a lot of questions that are received after that because they're like, why weren't folks supportive of lowering the tax from 5 to 1%? The main reason why that's really not what was going to happen. What was going to happen was, you remember, you just heard Mr. Quilty from LSO say that if most of that, or the majority, 80% of that uranium is from the United States, the nuclear generation tax would be 0. So really, when that proposal came out, you were actually increasing the tax on the nuclear industry as long as they were sourcing it from Wyoming uranium. So it wasn't going from 5 to 1. It was actually going from 0 to 1. And so I just wanted to make that note clear because that was a lot of conversation that I heard after that proposal. So just something to consider there as well. Again, just a clarifying point. Any questions on that?
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that's helpful. And I'm sorry, I'm just going back to that point. So as long as it's sourced by Wyoming uranium, the tax is 0. So conceptually, we're receiving severance tax on that. Is that true? Is that not true? Similar to coal or gas?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, semi-true. It's United States uranium. So it's United States uranium. Okay. And then the answer is yes. If it is Wyoming uranium, there would be a severance tax on it. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay. Last point, and then I know there are other speakers and topics. Topic of sales tax on electricity. If you want those figures, I have them for you. The first one, if you look at the Department of Revenue's NAICS code report, We do an aggregated NAICS code report. We separate our industries based on NAICS code. And if you look at our utility NAICS code on our report, it says $77 million. You're going to say, hey, Brett, when I look at some of your previous fiscal notes, I don't see 77 million, I see 43 million. The reason being is that if you actually go into our NAICS codes and you actually pull companies that go through the Public Service Commission, and if you actually look at individual companies that make up that NAICS code, it's not just utility companies. It's companies that support the utility industry as well. And so that's why the last fiscal note combined state and local was $44 million statewide, state pennies, local pennies. So you're really looking at this between 43 and 77 million if you were to exempt all sales tax on electricity. One of the comments that I heard was, Mr. Chairman, Senator Case has actually done this a couple different ways in his bills as well. The first one is you can exempt electricity. So you put an exemption in statute. We've got 50 plus of them in sales and use tax. That's one avenue to do this. In the latest version of this topic, there was a proposal to remove electricity from the definition of tangible personal property, which in effect just makes it not taxable in Wyoming. So there's kind of two approaches that you could look at doing this. Again, it's a policy decision, but you could exempt it, which is an option, or you could just remove it from the definition of tangible personal property, which I believe was what's in the last version in Senate File 300, but make sure you fact check me on that. But again, two ways to make that non-taxable if that was your policy decision. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to stand for any more questions.
Representative Riggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Director Fanning. Just go back briefly about the generation tax and sales tax out of state. So my understanding then, the producer pays the generation tax and then later on passes that tax on to out-of-state customers, because we have seen charts and spreadsheets where it identifies that dollar being paid from out-of-state customers. So, and we said that you couldn't charge them sales tax if they're out of state. So is that because the producer paid the generation tax before it left the state and then simply asked for a reimbursement for that? Would that be correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Ergens, yes, it is correct. I want to provide some examples. We see this all the time. It's called a markup. And so if I were to get my electricity bill that I get right now, right, if we were to exempt sales tax or make it non-taxable, that's gone from my bill. But the price to provide the electricity to me has gone up. So it would be implied that that additional 3.5%, 2.5%, 4.5%, whatever percentage it is actually baked into the price of the total electricity that I'm paying. Now, you've just heard from the industry that maybe that's not an equal. Let me rephrase that. Maybe it costs more than 3.5% if you were to put that in the earnings. But the general thought process on that concept is, okay, the generator is going to pay an additional 3.5%, but me as the consumer, it's 6% or 5% or 5.25%, whatever it is, 5-6% lower. So at the end of the day, the retail consumer, I'm going to see a lower price. That's in theory how that concept is supposed to work.
Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman, so the thinking's kind of evolved on the sales, the excise tax, the sales tax on electricity. And it's occurred to me that we have more policy options than just getting rid of the sales tax. We could reduce it It doesn't have to be the same rate as the sales tax on other goods. We it could apply a grand total of 3% to electricity, for example, not the 6, not the 5, not the extra pennies. We could. And I talked to Mr. Fanning about this, and he has his own viewpoints on this, and he'll explain. But the second thing is, we could exempt certain customers from paying the sales tax on electricity. This is where it gets really powerful. We could exempt residential customers, for example, or industrial customers, and leave it in place for other things. We'd have to write out those categories. And I had asked Mr. Fanning, is we getting in trouble with things like streamlined sales tax policy? But we have more tools than taking away the sales tax completely for everybody. And this is real significant as we try to make all these pieces come together. And I appreciate Mr. Fanning being a bit of a thinking partner. I don't think he necessarily, I'm not asking him to agree on me, but there is flexibility in applying sales taxes that we could explore. And maybe he'd like to comment on it, and I don't mean to put him on the spot.
Mr. Chairman, happy to elaborate on that conversation. Really 2 points in there. The first point is, could the state of Wyoming, in simplest of terms, our statewide sales tax rate is 4%. Okay, everyone in the state of Wyoming pays 4% on a taxable item. Could we, in theory, charge 4% on everything, but then charge 3% on electricity? And the answer is yes. It does not put us out of compliance with the streamlined sales tax agreement as it's currently written. Over the past few years, the streamlined sales tax agreement has had some updates where you can actually charge a lower rate on electricity. Something to consider. And I do have some documents. I'm more than happy to provide those as well. Again, it's very thin, narrow carve-outs, but that is something that you could potentially look at doing. Again, subject to approval via streamlined sales tax. For those who don't know, streamlined sales tax, there's 24 states that are involved in it. Wyoming is one of them. And it's an agreement to make sales tax collections easier for the retailers to administer. So there's consistent definitions across states, consistent administration practices, just something to consider there. The second part of Senator Case's point is an exemption. So if the legislature wanted to put an exemption on all electricity that's sold to a residential property, or fill in the blank terms there, I mean, that's something we do right now, where we treat different industries, different taxpayers different. Now you're shifting burdens. That's important to note. But we have plenty of exemptions in our sales tax statutes where we treat customers different just based on what they do, what industry they're in, fill in the blank. But it is another tool, just to use Senator Case's words, where there probably is some options there. Again, subject to legal review from your staff and other staff, but there are some options there if that's something the committee and the legislature in full is looking at doing.
Representative Riggins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Related to that, so if you did get rid of if we decide to make that exception, could that be undone by municipalities increasing franchise fees, et cetera, et cetera?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Riggins, not your expert to answer that question as it relates to the franchise fees. Now, as it relates to sales tax, the answer is no. A municipality, a county cannot enact their own sales tax. It's actually a cornerstone still of the streamline agreement, and you'll actually find it in several spots in statute. So the answer is no on a sales tax. A municipality couldn't just implement their own sales tax. But as far as other fees, surcharges, tariffs that are put onto the bill, not your best resource, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Case.
With regard to franchise fees, the legislature could still legislate that. And you could we looked at a few years ago in the Corporations Committee of capping the franchise fees that a municipality could impose on a utility. There are also some court basis. There was a famous case in Illinois about, what's the upper limit? In essence, can a municipality impose fees for revenue as opposed to impose fees for the cost of having the utility within their boundaries? And definitely municipalities push the envelope, but the broad purpose is to recover the cost of servicing the utility and having them in their deal. So there is a limit. And we also control that limit because we could set it by legislation.
Any more public comment? Let's move on to distribution of taxes on large electrical loads. I believe that's you, Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman, I already did cover this kind of in concept. The issue is when you have mega loads, could we think about those loads as being the taxes at least being in part and a revenue source for the state and not just the local jurisdiction that has the load? There's nowhere else in the state that has the unique characteristics that our capital city enjoys right now, with respect to transportation hubs, with respect to telecommunications, fiber lines, with respect to proximity to the Front Range of Colorado. It's kind of a windfall, you could argue, and that it's astounding. Tomorrow we get plans for a new data center, for example, that dwarfs everything else that we've had. It seems to, there's got to be an end to it, I suppose, Mr. Chairman, but it just seems, it just blows me away how the amount of electricity these things produce and consume. And there's a sale there that is a taxable sale. And where does that revenue go? I suggest with this bill that on very large loads, that we think about helping the local governments in the state of Wyoming by taking that money, a portion of it, and redistributing it and using it to fund the direct distribution or a part of it. That's a very significant thing that gives the rest of the municipalities in the state a more reliable revenue stream, helps us with our fiscal issues, and recognizes the uniqueness of these assets, for example. That's the idea, Mr. Chairman, and completely.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator. So one of the things, and I think we're kind of talking about that bill, I believe. And so when I read it, and I must confess, I probably didn't go into the detail. The way it was worded, it sounded like that proposal, and I obviously we could tailor that however, was for all revenue. There's one statement in there that said all revenue related would go into this pool. Was it your thinking on this concept that we would use, I'm just going to say we've kind of changed that to a 60-40 split, I believe. Was your concept all, or was your concept that the state would still see their 60 and the amount that would go into the pool was that 40? I guess I would like to hear your thoughts on that, what you were thinking, if that's an open discussion, or I'd just like to hear where you're kind of at on that, because it looked to me like it was all, and I was questioning the 60-40 split and how that played in. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, for the question. it's open book. I mean, open proposal in terms of we could do it however we wanted. Now that's windfall revenue in terms of the current split of sales tax. That's windfall revenue for the state of Wyoming right now. So it's a windfall that we could put towards the local governments, for example. We weren't counting on it. It's also excess revenue for the local district jurisdictions. So we could, come up with your own ideas. Leave 10%. They get all of it up to 100 megawatts, which is huge, gigantic, and a lot of revenue. And then they get 10% on a sliding scale for the rest of it, for example. And the rest goes into a pool to fund local governments. It's totally up to us to decide that. But we need a stable funding for local governments around the state. It's not really fair that windfalls accumulate in one area. And frankly, the state really doesn't necessarily need that revenue. So we could commit our share, take a portion of the other share, and fund direct distribution. The numbers are fungible. But the rate at which we get, these data centers are so big and the electricity demand is so big, it's like adding an entire state's sales of electricity with one place. It's amazing.
Representative Worf.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess a question that I have is trying to put things together. We're trying to do away with personal property tax, of which 70% of that goes towards school, to education. I'm wondering if the bill sponsor has looked at that as maybe a better avenue, if we can tie those together, because I know that's kind of the goal of this committee, is to do away with personal property tax. If we could get this tax to take that monkey off the backs of the personal property tax, to me, that's what I'm looking at, is there a way we could substitute that, thereby eliminating the need for that tax to be collected from personal property tax, have it paid by the wind generation instead. Have you thought about that, Senator Case?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Representative. I think when you're saying personal property tax, you're not talking about business personal property. You're talking about residential. Okay. The terms, you always got to be clear on this. So this committee in the legislature has kind of pursued reducing, leading to eliminating property taxes. I've heard it articulated on this committee. And you guys know I'm not in favor of that, but that has policy implications. The property tax doesn't fund anything for the state of Wyoming. It totally funds local governments and it funds schools. So it seems likely that if we're going to use sales taxes to try to backfill some of those losses due to the property tax reduction, we should consider those sources, local governments and schools. So the electricity tax is a sales tax. The local governments are one of the entities that lose money, and they also, it's an entity that gets a direct distribution that we have to play with every year. They don't automatically get made up like the schools do through what we used to call power equalization, but we make up the difference in Cheyenne. So I pick local governments because they're the odd persons out as we make this transition, and also the fact that they already have to kind of come to get money from Cheyenne. Which it's kind of unfortunate. We distribute more money from Cheyenne than other states do from their state capitals, and our local governments are more weakly funded, for example. So that's where the property tax discussion gets under my skin a little bit, because we're hurting local entities, and people live in those local entities and they're getting the relief, but their entities are getting harmed. So I chose local governments. Doesn't have to be local governments, but it is a huge amount of money that I don't think should accrue to any one community in our state. I think that is just the wrong policy going forward. It encourages over construction of these things, and really it's almost a new whole world of thinking that I'm not sure is appropriate.
Follow up.
Follow up.
Thank you. And I guess I just look at, I agree with you, Senator Case. I'm just looking at that as an avenue. I don't want to create a pool of money that's so large that it becomes a cash cow for anybody. But I wonder if we shouldn't be maybe setting up another account, I hate to say it, but like LISRA, that it is designed to put money in a pool, that then we as a legislative body would be able to appropriate those funds wherever needed. The Constitution obligates us to fund our education. I think 70% of our property tax being consumed by education, and that's not enough money. I do think that we got to figure out another way to get that monkey off the back of the property owners, because I agree, we took away the food tax. We promised the counties they would be made whole, and that lasted for a very short period of time. And so I agree, our local governments are probably weakly funded. And I just wonder if we aren't looking at something that would be real similar to what we set up with the LISRA account, but it would be generated primarily from the wind energy produced in the state.
Okay, Representative Lane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Case, on page 2 of your bill, you have a definition of a very large load electrical being is 100 megawatts per single purchaser or customer. And I was curious to know, does that also, have you talked to things like Walmarts or large industrial providers? Is that a large enough load to be able to exempt them from this and just get to data centers?
I'll try to give you an example, and there are people in the audience that can help, but a really big industrial load, like a Trona mine with all the processing, or potentially a refinery, they're not even 100 megawatts. I mean, this is smaller than that. You know, and there's another point in there too, Representative, is that we're measuring that by the use of the capacity, you know, the amount of electricity that could be created and delivered instantaneous. A measure of watts is what it is, but it's not a measure of production over time. So it's not the same as megawatt is just a measure of capacity. And that may not be the right measure to have as your basis for setting the tax. It more likely would be a consumption base. It's not just you could demand 100 megawatts, it's that you use more than 100 megawatt hours at any within a fixed amount of time. So that might be a better way and a more administratable way to create the tax. So could use some work. But that's a good question, Representative. Really good question.
Okay, I want to open this up for public comment. If anybody wants to speak on this. The review of tax for wind, solar, nuclear, and data centers. Can you tie that up pretty quick?
Mr. Chairman? Over here.
Representative Storer.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a question for Mr. Case, Senator Case, if I could. on the subject we were on. I'm just trying to understand because looking at SF 76, the idea was to put the 4% sales tax into this account, even though we have other methodologies for funding local governments from other sources as well. But the idea was, I mean, if it's general fund money, it's ideally supporting the whole state. So I just wanted to make sure I understood the reasoning behind putting it in the specific account.
Mr. Chairman, it's an earmark. It just says it's a source of revenue that local governments can count on. It's not the only one. So I earmarked it for that. That's why I did it with an account. You could earmark it without having an account. But policy-wise, I think we should do something with the revenue rather than just stick it in the LISRA or whatever, and not be clear that our intentions are to use that money, which is robbing Peter to pay Paul, but it's in a particular situation where the rest of the municipalities are disadvantaged and counties, and yet one is supremely advantaged by this in a way that was even unimaginable just a couple of years ago. So that it's earmarked. However that earmark occurs, I'd be happy with it. Doesn't have to be an account, doesn't have to be that account. But it's the idea is, I think it should fund something important like, and we already have direct distribution, so let's use it to offset that burden. That's all it is. It's open for working.
Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Case. Speaking of earmarks on this, what about, or is it possible to earmark this specifically to pay down residential homeowner occupied property taxes? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, of course, that's the legislature's prerogative to think of mechanisms how to do that. If you have individuals, say you create the fund and it exists, and then individuals can say, I don't want to pay my property tax, I want the fund to pay it. We'd have to have some criteria to do that. It's less direct if we eliminate residential property taxes and we pretend like this makes it up. It is a revenue source that can go towards that, but it doesn't necessarily offset on a one-for-one basis people's taxes. You and I could maybe even agree on something where if people are poor or otherwise qualified, we could get rid of their taxes and we could pay it from this fund. I'd be happy to do that.
I think we're going to take this up after lunch. Like not realizing what time it is. What
if we work through lunch? Go home.
I'm good with that.
Like maybe an hour?
All those in favor of working through lunch, raise your hand. Oppose?
You'll find the testimony goes faster and faster and faster. It's an old committee trick.
Thank you. You asked the question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ken Gill, Department of Revenue, Property Tax Division. This topic, review of tax for wind, solar, nuclear, and data center facilities. For quick testimony, Mr. Chairman, they all pay property tax, and there is no specific exemption for any of them as far as property tax goes. And I'm not sure what other questions you have, Mr. Chairman.
Outstanding. Any testimony? Good job.
I'm sorry, I'm not torture. Just a bit.
Co-Chairman Locke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Gill. So just going back to some of these, I don't mean to, I'm probably crossing some weird lines here, but just in terms of, let's just use wind as an example and maybe across all of these. How much of this is, state assessed and how much of this is locally assessed? Can you just walk through that in a little detail, just so it's clear which pieces here are local, state? I know you've been over this before, but just trying to get my bearings on this piece of it. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, so it's a mixed bag for sure. A few years back, if you'll recall, it wasn't clear whether or not the Department of Revenue should be valuing independent power producers. There were a few bills that came before the legislative body. They failed to clarify that. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Our independent power producers are locally assessed by our county assessors and valued by our county assessors. Not saying, and you specifically spoke to wind, and possibly solar, obviously. Our department does have wind as part of our appraisals also. So some of our investor-owned utilities, they have wind along with coal, along with natural gas, other electrical generation. So we appraise those type of facilities, but our local county assessors appraise the independent power producers.
Yes. Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, and one of the things I think, and if you could just verify, what I think we see with that is we see to some degree inconsistencies in how, I'm bringing up that issue again of industrial versus other methods. We see inconsistencies of how that's done based on that distinction between state. I think the state takes a common approach, but I think when it comes to the local entities, they vary drastically on how property tax is calculated for wind, solar. They could use different land qualifications versus industrial, for example. And just if you could talk to that a little bit, the distinction and the fact that maybe it's inconsistently done. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, not knowing the local appraisals, I don't know them, honestly. Most of the counties that have those type of facilities are using a contractor to value them. I can't really speak to their appraisals. I can speak that the state, the appraisal service group uses all three approaches to value, considers all three approaches to value these properties. Now, can I tell you exactly how much this piece of land is worth? No, because we're using a unitary approach. So it's everything that company has as a unit, and then it's divvied out across the state and then down to the tax district level. So I can't ever give you a exact value of a piece of land where a turbine sits that is state assessed. And I really can't speak to the local.
And on that note, I think we will break for lunch. We'll be back here at 1:30. I believe the vote was 7-7. As I counted it.
It's good to continue.